I'm reading Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, and sharing my comments as I go along. This is my first reading. I didn't prepare and read it in advance. In the previous video, I got through about a quarter of the first rule, so I might need to speed up a bit. To summarize the previous material, various animals like lobsters, wrens, and chickens have dominance hierarchies, or, quote, pecking orders, and they have behavior to resolve conflicts over things like who gets a particular nesting spot. Jordan Peterson goes over the ways lobsters escalate so that many conflicts are resolved without the lobsters being injured. And that kind of strategy has better survival value, evolutionarily, than if they just fought to the death unnecessarily. A lot of my comments on the first part were questioning the ongoing assumption that animals are intelligent like humans are and feel emotions like humans do, and that the reasons they do things can be directly compared to humans. I think all those things are exaggerated and kind of false, and they were more ongoing assumptions rather than things that were actually being argued and explained, or even referenced with a citation. And in my own research, looking at the literature, I've found that that's what it's always like. Even though this is a popular book, I've found that the more scholarly literature is not any better at providing reasons why I'm mistaken or arguments that actually address the animals as non-intelligent computer programs model very well. So if you're interested in that topic, definitely look at the first video. I like Jordan Peterson. I'm reading this book because I'm a fan. I'm hoping to agree with other parts of the book and find value in it. But regardless of whether I disagree or agree, my plan is just to read it and say what I think and try to tell the truth as best I can figure it out. I'm gonna start reading now. I'm at this section, the neurochemistry of defeat and victory, which is where I left off last time. So this is a good example of what I was talking about in the first video. Are lobsters actually cocky and strutting, which are human concepts relating to human social dynamics? Or do lobsters just run a computer algorithm in their brain which decides whether to back down when challenged or not, and takes into account the levels of serotonin and octopamine that they currently have? Or alternatively to that, there could be an algorithm taking into account some other factors that both decides how much the lobster backs down and decides how much of the chemicals to release. So there could just be an underlying factor causing both, which is why they're correlated. So I found throughout that the things being said about animals and how similar they are to humans could be read in a different way that was compatible with the evidence presented, the reasoning given. This is what I would call a conclusion statement about the issue I'm questioning, rather than an argument. The book's starting point assumes some things I already disagree with, and doesn't really try to debate them, it just keeps saying them in different ways. And there are things that a lot of people take for granted without really having thought through, where the dissenting positions have not really been addressed in popular public ways that I've been able to find. So I don't like that, where an idea is being taken for granted by a lot of people, and Jordan Peterson is helping spread it, and there isn't much attention to dissent for some reason. Okay, this indicates that it's not an underlying factor that spits out the serotonin and also causes the behavior. The actual serotonin levels directly are being taken into account for the behavior. So this is a exaggeration, or I think it's actually just false. Humans do not have the same behavioral effects from antidepressants as lobsters given serotonin. Like, if you think about it in a very literal way, what actions do the lobsters take? Humans do not do the same thing. They still use judgment in human ways. Like, humans aren't lobsters, and they're so completely different that even the very concept of having the same behavioral effect between humans and lobsters doesn't really make sense. Like, you have to define your terms more than that. Humans do not go around acting like lobsters unless you define very specific points of comparison in a clear way. So maybe he means that humans on certain drugs have more upright postures on average. That would be plausible, and that would be a point of similarity between humans and lobsters that you could measure and evaluate in a reasonable way. But even then, when you say that two things have the same effect, you have to be pretty careful about what you mean. Even if it's posture and they both have more upright postures, that doesn't mean it's the same. Like, maybe the humans have 70% more upright postures according to some measure, while the lobsters have 30% more upright postures by the equivalent measure. There's different levels of precision you can look at these things with. But the level of precision in the book so far is basically to say when lobsters put their limbs in certain configurations, they're like Clint Eastwood. And if you're going to compare like that, then I don't think it's very accurate. You can't learn how to be Clint Eastwood just by copying lobsters. Like, if you gave a child a bunch of pictures of lobsters, he wouldn't know how to do all the things Clint Eastwood does. Maybe some of them, depending on how you explained it to him and what you taught him to look for. But there's definitely things Clint Eastwood does that don't have a lobster equivalent, which are important to the way he's perceived by people. It's not like everything Clint Eastwood does has a parallel with lobsters, and the human-only ones are important. And they're being neglected here so far. Prozac gets different behaviors out of lobsters. Whether or not that's cheering up is something that requires serious thought instead of just offhand comments like these. I'm going to look at the footnote 10. Yeah, that's a typical citation. I've read a lot of papers similar to these and found the quality is reliably very low. It turns out the paper was really easy to find by Googling the name. So I'm going to take a look at it. So the drugs modulate posture and behavior in some crustaceans. Agonistic? Does that mean like antagonistic? Is it the same? Combative, polemical. Okay, so it's very similar to antagonistic. Probably shares some sort of root word. They don't normally have lasting dominance hierarchies. This is some sort of lobster, I guess. Yeah, we were talking about lobsters, so that's whatever Munida quadrapicina is. I guess it's a type of lobster. Oh, it says lobsters right here. Okay, good. Okay, so that's interesting. It's because just from what I've heard in Jordan Peterson's video in general, he says basically lobsters have dominance hierarchies. And then this paper says lobsters do not develop lasting dominance hierarchies. At least this particular type. They just have temporary short-term interactions. So that actually means that what Jordan Peterson was saying in the book is contradicted by his own citation. Because I'm going to look for it. I remember he was saying something about if they don't leave. Here we go. There were like two statements. The losers unlikely to survive the dispute if they stay in the winner's territory. They're now mortal enemies. That makes it sound like the winner will keep attacking the loser in a lasting way. And like there's a memory. And that they get driven out of the territory. But this says they don't have lasting dominance hierarchies. That is, there isn't lasting memory of who fought who and who won. There's just the current situation with short-term dominance interactions. Wait, it says this differs from lobsters and crayfish. I'm really confused now because it says that they're lobsters and then it says that they differ from lobsters. Alright, let's try looking up what Munida wait. Space? Oh, so that's like not a regular lobster, it's a different type, I think, I guess. Or that's not the type we eat at restaurants, I think. Right, it looks different than this guy and this guy. These are the more normal lobster image. And these are like a little thinner. Possibly smaller. It's hard to get a sense of scale from the pictures. Oh, here's a hand. Yeah, definitely smaller. Okay, so they're a type of lobster, but then when they say they're different than lobsters, they probably mean the ones I think of as normal lobsters. But again, this is interesting because Jordan Peterson says lobsters have dominance hierarchies, and this is saying that regular lobsters don't even respond to serotonin and octopamine, or whatever it is. Octopamine. Serotonin, octopamine. Okay, so let's look at specifically what this article was cited for. Prozac even cheers up lobsters. And this is supposed to show the evolutionary continuity of life on Earth, even though the abstract says that it doesn't work with lobsters and crayfish. But it does happen to work with this particular type of lobster in some way. Maybe it works with both of them, just in different ways. Because this is saying American lobsters and crayfish work. Okay, 5-HT is serotonin and OA is octopamine. That's what I was thinking from what I was saying, but I wanted to check. Oh yeah, here's an abbreviations list as well. So OA inhibits the effect of serotonin rather than causing something directly. But also the behavior roles and perhaps also mechanisms clearly differ among crustaceans. So there's a lack of evolutionary continuity there, contrary to the book's statement. Okay, so lobsters are more studied and they found a different type to study. So they could do comparative analysis. I wonder if it says Prozac, no. Cheer, no. Let's see what Prozac is made out of. So Prozac is this molecule. Where's the chemical formula? Here we go. 17 carbons, 18 hydrogens, 3 fluorides, and 1 NO. What's NO? Nitric oxide, I guess. Or was that not a single chemical? Nitric oxide totally sounds like nitrogen plus oxygen combined or something. Oh, it's 1 nitrogen and 1 oxygen. It's not one thing, it's 2 things. My bad. Okay. 70 carbons and 18 hydrogens and 3 fluorides and 1 nitrogen and 1 oxygen. Okay, because what I wanted to do is compare this to serotonin just to confirm that they are different, which I believe they are. It looks pretty different. Maybe I should just Google it. Chemical. So it's a lot of the same stuff, carbon, hydrogen, but like that's really standard for molecules. It's got 2 nitrogens and an oxygen, but no fluoride. So definitely different. So, I think that literally Prozac does not cheer up lobsters. Um, it's hard to tell from this, but the paper does not say Prozac cheers up lobsters. Aggression is used solely for transient space claims in these populations, and most aggressive acts appear to be bluff. Threats which are ignored and almost never followed by aggressive acts. So for crayfish, aggressive acts are rare and dominance hierarchies don't exist. Wait. Oh no, that's for the M quadricipina. But for American lobsters, aggression and fights are common and used to establish dominance hierarchies. Okay, so regular lobsters do have dominance hierarchies, but he cited a paper about a different type that doesn't really. And he put that under the heading of evolutionary continuity, but it's a lack of evolutionary continuity in terms of dominance hierarchies. And the paper is not primarily about whether serotonin cheers up lobsters, let alone Prozac. It's about a different species, a subspecies of lobsters, but they're different. And they're not what he normally means when referring to lobsters. Like, this is about a different animal than the more studied American lobster. So, Prozac cheers up lobsters. If you take that as like a very informal, unserious claim, as a loose approximation, I could see how it would be somewhat reasonable. However, he put a cite on it to a scientific paper, which gives the impression that it's an exact, serious scientific claim. But then his own citation doesn't back him up on it. It doesn't say anything about giving Prozac to lobsters. It talks about giving serotonin to M. quadricipina, which is different. It's not the same chemical or the same animal. And it also doesn't say anything about cheering up. The citation, the actual paper, talks about posture and aggression. And how many aggressive acts they make and their posture. That's it. Whether you take that as cheer is a matter of interpretation not covered in this paper. So I can retract what I was saying earlier before I saw the paper about suspecting it of being low quality. There are a lot of low quality papers, but there's also a lot of papers more like this one, which are a different kind of thing. The paper is okay, but it doesn't say the thing that it's being cited for. The paper is less ambitious. You know, I was expecting a paper that actually said stuff about cheering up lobsters with Prozac, and a paper like that I would expect probably to be low quality, based on my history of reading these things. But if the paper doesn't actually say the things that it's being cited for, then it can easily just be a much more mundane paper that does reasonable research that's not overly ambitious and does fine with it, but then doesn't actually make a bunch of huge claims. So there's sort of two types of papers, the like overly ambitious, low quality ones that try to make big claims, and the more serious ones that try to make smaller claims, and they're actually okay, but then they get cited for things they don't say. See, the paper's pretty careful with what it says. Like, it puts the higher control centers of the lobster in quotes. Like, it's basically saying they don't know and aren't making claims about how lobster brains work, whether they think like humans at all. There's none of that. It's just saying there is some sort of way the lobster's behavior is controlled, some center in the lobster controlling it, and whatever that is, however it works, here's what we observed. Like, they're trying not to accidentally say something that's more than they actually know. which is good, I approve of that, but then Jordan Peterson's trying to use it in a different way, contrary to the spirit of the paper. So, defeated looking, scrunched up, inhibited, drooping, skulking sort of lobster. But if you search the paper, oops, droop. Droop is not there. Skulk. Nope. Scrunch. Nope. Defeat. Well, defeat's probably, oh no, it's not. Inhibit. That one might be here. Just the one time. But it's talking about inhibiting actions. So, there's a lot of literary license here. Very likely to hang around street corners. Okay, this is... I don't like the mix of this unserious style combined with cites to serious research papers that it is not perfectly corresponding to. Like, it's trying to say that you should accept its claims basically as if they were science because he's read the details and this stuff is right, but he's going way beyond the details and he's not really bridging the gap. Like, there's a big gap to get from this paper to the approximations he's saying in the book. And he's not making the arguments that go in between. And he's just sort of saying, here's my claims and here's my cites. And they're not really directly related. The cites don't directly back him up. And he frequently just switches between more literal and less literal statements, so that it's actually kind of hard for people to tell which things are serious claims and which ones are not meant to be true statements in the book. Like, it's hard to tell the difference. They're not clearly differentiated, and he just keeps throwing in both. Because it's not like everything is as inexact as hanging around street corners being a comment on lobsters. There's plenty of things that are more exact, like right here when he was describing 4 different levels of lobster behavior. And he went through in some level of detail what the different ways lobsters go through conflicts are. Where they're like showing their claws and spraying chemicals to show their size or communicate their size. And then they're moving around, moving their limbs around and moving forward and backwards. And then if they keep going, they try to flip each other onto the backs. That was the next one. And then the next one after that is actually trying to rip each other's limbs or eye stalks off. And so those were pretty, like, serious statements that I read them as literally, this is what lobsters do. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't an analogy. This is supposed to actually be describing reality in a scientific way. And then a little later, we're just reading about we're reading about Clint Eastwood and lobsters at street corners. And, I mean, this is the same sentence that's trying to tell us about neurochemical configuration and ratios of octopamine and serotonin, which makes it sound like scientific. And then he's taking some literary license to say, like, drooping and skulking. And then he's taking even more literary license, and it's just not very constant on how literally true it is. And I think what happens when you write this way, for most readers, is they get an overall impression of, 1, what the book said, and 2, that the book has science behind it. But the overall impression of what the book said involves all sorts of not-so-scientific statements that went into it. So I think what ends up happening in people's minds is you get the prestige and rigor of science applied to some statements it shouldn't apply to. And that's what people come away with. This is hard to argue with because it's just an echo, and it's not a defined echo. So some sort of limited echo of some sort. Okay, I guess so. But why is such a vague sentence here? What's the reader supposed to take away from it? They're going to come away thinking that there is evolutionary continuity, and as a result of that, various human situations are a lot like lobster situations. They're going to overestimate the echo, or why was it even worth mentioning? This statement is phrased weakly enough to be defensible instead of just literally false. Which is necessary because there's massive differences between those soldiers or children and lobster tail reflex triggers. But while it's a weak statement, it's meant to give the reader the impression that it's important and has some impact. And even if it does, like, this is not an argument. This is a conclusion statement, and a very vague one at that. As far as sort of actual arguments so far, what do we have? We have some of the same chemicals regulate posture and some behaviors that could be compared in some unspecified way between both lobsters and humans, and also resolving dominance disputes of some sort is a concept that could be thought about in regards to both lobsters and humans. Well, this is a nasty statement. Rich people in human societies do not have, quote, loot. Well, it depends on the society. Maybe they do in certain African tribes, for example. Maybe in Senegal. But or I was just reading about how, well, I saw it on Twitter that I think it was Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian chairman guy, was buying a $50 million private airplane while getting really mad about how they desperately need more funding. And, you know, that loot, that is loot, and it was supposed to go to the people, and he took it. And you see the same thing in Iran, where there are a bunch of protests right now, because a bunch of wealth has come into the country, both as a result of the Iranian nuclear deal and also just in general, like sometimes wealth, you know, some wealth is produced. And the corrupt elites are basically keeping most of the wealth, taking it, not letting it benefit most of the people who live there. But the US is absolutely nothing like that. In the US, you don't just get to loot things and that's to be rich. You know, that's illegal and policed in a serious way. And the US government positions are not about personal enrichment. It's not perfect, there's exceptions, but it's not like the bulk of the rich people in the US got rich by graft and corruption. That's not what's happening. They primarily get rich by being involved with productive, large businesses. And a company like Apple or Walmart is not a looting company. They are selling products to the public on a voluntary basis. And that's where a lot of wealth comes from for a lot of the rich people. I need to open this a second time so I can get sites better. Oops. Okay, so the site on this loot thing is a Credit Suisse report. Sorry, document not found. This book came out like 3 days ago, something like that. And the citation doesn't work. That sucks. Let's see if Archive has it. Nope. Alright, let's see if it is findable. Skip to search. Global Wealth Report 2015. Their website seems just sort of broken. Search engine. 2017. 2018, 2017. The Global Wealth Report, 2015, PDF. Okay, this is interesting. It looks very similar to the link that didn't work. I want to see if it was actually the fault of the book, like by comparing. Are these the same? Copy. No, there's some difference. I'm not seeing the difference visually. Let's see. Is this part the same? Yeah. Alright. That's the same. Where did it become different? Somewhere around the .com? Like, what the hell? What? Is it the slash? No. Wait, it's the T? Oh, the T is a special character somehow, for some reason. Okay, so if I just take this from here, and then I put in my own T. No, that still didn't fix it. There's some other issue. Why is copy pasting not working? It looks like plain text. Okay, I got an actual plain text only text editor window, and when I copy paste from the book, it's like this. I'm gonna check the EPUB. Okay, so I guess that's some sort of problem with the RTF conversion. Is screwing up the URL. Doesn't seem to be the book's fault. Okay, well, I found it. Oh, page 11. Okay, that's good. Good info to know where to look. The bottom half of adults collectively own less than 1% of total wealth. And okay, this does not say the thing in the book. The next page might. So this says that the top 1% have 44.8% of the wealth, down like 4%. That does not give us a direct comparison to the bottom 50% though. I think this chart is saying that like a lot of the people in the third decile of wealth, so between like 20% of people are worse than them and 60% are better, and they're somewhere in between there, are in India and Asia Pacific. Then if you go to like, you know, the top 10% of people, you get a lot of people in North America and Europe, but also Asia Pacific, but very few in India. I was just glancing at this because I thought the word loot was very biased. So I wanted to see if it was some like really left-wing anti-capitalist source. That was why I looked at it originally, but now I'm just disturbed that the site doesn't seem to match the paper. Like I want to read it really carefully and see if I'm missing something. So he says the top 1% have the same amount of money as the bottom 50%. And this says that the bottom 50% have less than 1% of the money. So, and the top 1% certainly have more than 1% of the money. So that means that the top 1% have more money than the bottom 50%. It's not the same. To be in the top 10%, you only need 70 grand. 68,800. To be the top 1%, though, is a lot harder. You need 760,000. The top 10% have 87.7%. The top 1% have 44.8%. These aren't like exactly the same stat. Like this fell during a time period, but it's, you know, about right. So what I'm getting from this is that the top 1% have around 50 times as much wealth as the bottom 50% combined. Whereas Jordan Peterson has said as much loot. Oh wait, he goes on. And where the richest 85 people have as much as the bottom 3.5 billion. Well then why, if you know that 85 people match the bottom half, then why would you say that the top 1% have as much as the bottom 50% when they don't have as much, they have way more? Like that's just really careless, because even the rest of his sentence contradicts him. And also the site does not say the thing that he's saying. And also he didn't give a cite on this one. This is a statistical claim. Why not cite this one? Like it's kind of strange. Why not just, if this info is from the same report, he should just put the cite at the end of the sentence and then give 2 different page numbers. I'm going to search for 85. Maybe that's a findable thing. This is not working very well. I'm gonna save this. You have to be careful with trusting citations. Just because there's a citation does not mean that the sentence with a little superscript number on it is accurate. The same brutal principle of unequal distribution. Well, what's brutal about it? This is a serious moral claim, which is reasonably controversial. There are definitely pro-capitalist people. They're not the majority, but it's a well-known view that not everyone is an anti-inequality leftist. Not everyone views the world through that particular lens. There are people like objectivists, like me, who don't quite see the problem here and actually think that there's a particular essay I'm gonna pause and find it. Okay, I got the post I wanted. I will put this in the YouTube description. This essay is called How a Highly Productive and Provident 1% Provides the Standard of Living of a Largely Ignorant and Ungrateful 99%. So, and this is from an economist. I've read his treatise, Capitalism, a Treatise on Economics. It's long, detailed, very serious and scholarly. I think it's very good, and I agree with his essay, and I'm not the only one. So, I think it's interesting that Jordan Peterson, who is very, very anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-Stalin, anti-Soviet, anti-Maoist, is also writing an anti-capitalist talking point. Just calling this brutal is an anti-capitalist talking point. Brutal is a bad thing. Whereas the pro-capitalist view says that wealth inequality is not a brutal thing that's hurting people. It is a good aspect of capitalism, a positive thing that's making the world better. The very short summary is capital accumulation increases the productivity of labor, and not just the rich person's labor, but the poor person's labor. So why do 85 people have so much money? Now, it's not good in every case. Like, I think one of those guys is Carlos Slim, who I don't know a lot about it, so I don't really want to attack him. But from the little bit I've heard, maybe he didn't get his money by the methods I approve of. So there's probably someone in the 85 who I would say that person is not living properly, and maybe they did some looting to get money, and maybe they've hurt other people to get money. But there are other people in the 85, like Bill Gates, say, who got there by production, by helping people have reasonably well-working computers at prices that they thought were well worth buying. A lot of that 85 is people who helped create and sell consumers' goods that a lot of poorer people wanted to buy. They helped make high-quality, cheap things for the masses, which is what capitalism does in general, is the bulk of production goes towards things for the bulk of the market, the man on the street, not the rich person. The majority of scientific papers are published by a very small group of scientists. That does not, at first hearing, sound to me like a bad thing. Like, most people are not good scientists. And even among scientists, some are better than others. Some are quite a bit better than others. There's probably like a bell curve, and as an approximation. It's very hard to rate scientists on a single dimension of quality, like just give everyone one rating on the same scale, because people vary in multiple attributes. But, you know, as a loose approximation, you could give every scientist a 1 to 100 score and then get something along the lines of a bell curve, probably. And so then what you want to happen is the outliers who are really good publish a lot. And they commonly would be the people who, because they're so successful and good at it, like their work, care about their work, want to publish a lot, get more involved. And so they do publish more. And they, of course, have an easier time getting their papers published because they're valued more. So that sounds like a good thing. Like, there's some filtering at work, and it's not just random who gets to publish and who does publish. A small proportion of musicians produce almost all the recorded commercial music. Most musicians don't sell their work, sure. I think it would have been a better comparison to say, like, a small proportion of musicians get most of the views, most of the attention, most of the audience, rather than just, like, choose to sell their work or not, because you can be in that proportion of musicians just by putting something on sale and selling one copy for $1, and that's all you've ever sold, but you're still producing, that's commercial music if you've put it on sale and sold something ever. It's arguably commercial even if you never sell one copy, as long as you put it on sale. So this is not a very well thought out way of writing this sentence. But I think the broad theme behind it about a small number of musicians have most of the success in the industry is accurate. Like, I was looking at some of the most popular YouTube videos the other day, and there are music videos with over 2 billion views. 2 billion views. That's like if everyone in the US watched it, like, 5 or 6 times. That's a very, very large number of views. And, you know, a regular artist, even if they were doing pretty well and they could get, like, I don't know, thousands of people like their stuff and enough to even pay for it so that they could make a living, you know, there's still, most of them are never going to come near 1 billion views across all of their work, rather than just on a single video. Yeah, some, definitely, a lot of books sell very few copies, and a few books sell a lot of copies, because some books provide something that a lot of people want. That's not the only reason. It's once a book starts catching on, it gets more attention. Like, there's network effects. There's things that reinforce the success of books. Like, if 2 books are both good, and then one of them gets a good start, and then people start spreading it by word of mouth, and the other one just has trouble getting off the ground, then you can get very different results in how much they sell. Okay, there's something else weird here, though. It's not just that this isn't brutal. I mean, especially in the capitalist case. Because, okay, if you think about, like, the book industry or the music industry, I wouldn't want to use the term brutal, because that sounds like violent, even. Right, brutal means savagely violent. I mean, it's not the only meaning, but it absolutely sounds like you might be talking about violence, and we are not talking about violence. So, not a good word. But So like the music industry is harsh. It is difficult. It is hard to be successful in. A lot of people try and fail. So, but with the capitalism case, with the rich people, um, not so many people try to become billionaires. Some people do and fail, but a lot of people set their sights lower in the first place. Like with a musician, it's like it's hard to be successful enough just to support yourself at all. But with the capitalism thing, like you don't need to compete with Bill Gates and have a similar amount of money to Bill Gates to be successful. You know, if you were making 100 grand a year, that's like nothing compared to Bill Gates. But you're actually doing quite well and you can be happy and have a great life. And, you know, even with 30 grand a year, you could be happy and have a nice life. And Bill Gates is not stopping you from getting to 30 grand a year or even 100 grand a year. Like he's not your enemy there. It's not like there's a limited size pie and he's eating most of the pie, so there's not much left for you. Like that analogy is wrong. And that is the kind of analogy behind thinking it's brutal. And that's the kind of analogy that leads people to socialism. It's the kind of thing that gets people to be really anti-capitalist, and Jordan Peterson is feeding into that. I'm going to save this quote. He even mentions creative production. Like, we're not talking about brutalizing people. We're talking about producing things with your creativity, which is good. Okay, so the other thing I want to say is it's not a principle. It's a, I don't know, an observed fact. And there are logical reasons why it happens, but it's... Unequal wealth distribution is a consequence. It's not a principle itself. Like, it could be caused by some principle. There could be something that's making it happen. But Jordan Peterson has not identified what the principle is that causes it. He's just said it is a principle. No, it's a conclusion or a result, which is completely different than a principle. It's like, okay, this happened. Why did it happen? What's the principle behind it? He hasn't answered that. He's mixed up about what a principle is. Right. This is not a super great comparison though. Like you don't need to sell 100,000 copies to be successful. But what I've heard before is that most books, very few books even sell 10,000 copies. And you can imagine if you're selling less than 10,000 copies, you're probably not making very much money. Especially if you have a regular publishing deal where you're only getting like a 7% royalty. Then if you sell 10,000 copies, you're not going to do so good. Well, with a 7% royalty deal, you might not even make very much money, or at least not an amazing amount of money from 100,000 sales. Because you might only be getting like $1 per book. I mean, that's a lot, I guess. That's good, but it's not like you're becoming super rich. You're not joining the top 1% just because you had one of these super successful books. Like, tons of programmers make a lot more than that while being average. Instead of being 500 out of 1.5 million level outliers. Publishing books is just not a great way to make money. If your goal is to make a bunch of money, you should probably look at some other industry. This principle is sometimes known as Price's Law. I wonder if he actually gives a principle. This is a back reference topic sentence. I haven't finished reading, but... Okay. So, he did not state a principle more than before. He's still stating what happened. So what does he think the principle is? What's he trying to say? I think it's something like, this happens, that's how the world works. And he thinks that's a principle? But that still doesn't get into like what causes it. Alright, this principle is sometimes known as Price's law. You can model it with a graph with an L shape. So you have like low, 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 and then at the end it like skyrockets way up. The L would be on its side. Like if you take this L right here, you want to rotate it 90 degrees to the left, counterclockwise. Rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise, and that's the graph he's talking about. And then you put number of people on the vertical axis. Wait. And productivity or resources on the horizontal? Okay, he might not be doing it quite the way I was thinking. Oh, okay, I guess he's not rotating the L. So the very left is saying the vast majority of people have very little resources. So it's like it goes up to a very high number of people at the beginning, while the resources is still low. And then you go to the right and you have a lot of resources, but the number of people has gone way, way down. So to make the graph accurate, just think of the bottom left corner of the L and like make that a rounded corner instead of a right angle. And then you basically have the right graph. The basic principle had been discovered much earlier. What principle? Like saying this happens for some reason is not really a principle. So this is not accurate. I mean, maybe it could be, but the thing being observed here is at any given time, some people have a lot and most people have much less. But that does not mean that more things are being given to the people on top. Like maybe who's on top changes. Also, like giving and taking is not what's going on here. It's like some people produce more than others. Is different than being given it. Or in terms of like the cities, some cities produce more buildings, growth, spread, sprawl, expansion. People like the city and choose to live there and expand it and stuff. It's not just automatically given as like a law of physics. This is the kind of statement that leaves me wondering if it's a joke or if this is real. Like, do the lobsters actually go around and wake up other lobsters? I don't know. It's really hard to tell if Jordan Peterson is serious or not, because of the constant history of unserious statements mixed with serious statements and exaggerations, like about Prozac. That the literal factual statement about Prozac was some sort of joke or exaggeration. It wasn't, and that one even had a site. This one doesn't have a site. This one has a "who's their daddy" comment in it. So like even in this very sentence, there's clearly some sort of joking going on. It's really awkward because I don't know like how seriously to take which statements. Oh, so we didn't really get any elaboration of why Price's law happens. It's just sort of stated as a thing that happens for some reason. Like, he makes it sound sort of like a causal principle, but it's really just a observed result. And it certainly doesn't apply to everything, so you have... Like, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they find all these examples, and then wherever it's not an example, they say it doesn't apply there. So, yeah, it applies to the things it applies to. But, like, it's not, like, the top 1% of... Like, would the top 1% of pasta eaters eat 90% of the pasta? Does that sound realistic to you? And I think that the purchasing and consumption of pasta is somewhat more evenly distributed. A large number of people have moderate amounts of pasta, and there must be some people who eat quite a bit more than average, but like, how much more than the average amount of pasta could you eat before you'd like kill yourself or something? Like, you're gonna get full, so it limits how much more than is typical anyone can do. Like, with money, you can get 1,000,000 times richer than the average person, or 1,000,000,000 times. Like, there's no limit to it. But with pasta eating, there's a limit to it. You can only eat so many times more pasta than me before you just can't fit it in your body and it'll kill you to keep eating. So they call it a principle without really talking about the causation, and then they selectively apply it where it works and say, look, it works in a bunch of cases. Of course it does. It's a distribution, kind of like the bell curve. And yeah, not every distribution is common, so they picked one of the distributions that comes up in a decent number of cases, and then they just call that a principle. That's pretty silly. Well, maybe they become irresistibly attracted, but that's a human concept. Maybe they just start performing certain behaviors that have evolutionary survival value. Calling it a brilliant strategy is it makes it sound like there's thinking involved. So humans don't use the same strategy. They use a strategy which has some things in common with the lobster strategy when compared in certain ways. Like, there are comparisons you could make where you will find some overlap. There are also comparisons you could make where you'd find that it's different. And Jordan Peterson does not attempt to do an overall analysis of what are all the different comparisons he can think of that both do and don't make humans and lobsters similar in this way. And then how do we sort of sum up and come to some overall conclusion about similarity? He just says it's the one, like the same strategy used by females and other species, including humans. This is an exaggeration without proper analysis. You have to actually look at which things are similar and which are different in order to figure out the meaning of this. Because it's not just the same. Some things are the same, and why are those ones the same and why are other ones different? What's the actual overlap and why is that overlapping? Like, you don't really know anything when you only look at it this deeply. Wait, now he's explaining the strategy. This was sort of out of order. Like, it says they identify him quickly, and I thought the strategy was, I thought the strategy in question was hooking up with the top guy. But now he's talking about how they decide who the top guy is. This is like a little, it's hard to tell what he means. it's kind of like jerky. Like, this doesn't quite fit the topic sentence. Like, I thought we were talking about one thing and then suddenly we're talking about something else, which is specifically how the identification is done. So calling this computationally, this is a fancy word. It makes him sound smart. It makes him sound technically detailed, like, oh, we're talking about computation. We're dealing with all these fancy details about computers and stuff. But he's just saying a plain thing that could have done without this word. Like, I don't think it's accurate to say it takes too much computation, that's why it's not done. Like, I think the thing being suggested here is just not true. And it's certainly not argued or explained in any sort of meaningful detail. Like, doing your own computations is risky because you could get it wrong. And sort of following the herd, it has a level of safety of sort of not doing worse than the other females. Like, it might be good in some ways to risk missing out on opportunities that everyone else is missing out on, rather than risk missing out on opportunities that other people are not missing out on. Like, if all the other females are going for a particular guy, then if you differ, you risk missing out and being behind all those other females. And evolutionarily, that could be like really bad for the lobster. And not adequately compensated for by the possibility of finding an underappreciated male lobster. The machine-like calculations of the dominance hierarchy. So he's really trying to make it sound like it just takes too much computation to figure out. So you let the dominance hierarchy act like a computer for you. Like, this is not literally a good way to think about it in terms of computation. Like, he's writing in terms of metaphor and analogy, but then he's trying to make it sound as computery as he can to give it the prestige of precision. So I really disapprove of that. Like, if you want to go into fine details about computation and like estimates of the computational costs of different tasks and the computational power available in their brains and so on, and the evolutionary value of doing different computations, like, okay, do that, and then you can say things like this. But if you're just going to be sort of vague and waving your hands in the general direction of the ideas, which is a perfectly fine way to write a book, don't make it sound like you're going into details. Don't pretend you're going into details when you aren't. Like, have it one way or the other. Like, this is very suspicious to me because the dominance hierarchy is not a computer. It cannot do calculations. Like, brains are literally computers. Lobsters have brains that can do computations. The dominance hierarchy is not a physical object. Only physical objects can do calculations. So, at best, this is some sort of loose reference to some unexplained way the calculations are being done. They let males fight it out and peel their paramours from the top. But this is what happens with stock market pricing, where the value of any particular enterprise is determined through the competition of all. So you mean something like, instead of I personally try to evaluate every company, which is hard, instead there are mechanisms for information flow. Or to put it a different way, when identifying the best man, instead of looking at only the static characteristics, like take a snapshot of the man in isolation, out of his environment, with no other people, and just look at his characteristics. That's not a good approach. And it's better to use available information, like whether he won or lost recent fights. Or in the case of the market, instead of evaluating every company individually in isolation as if no other companies existed, you can take into account what other people think of the companies, how popular they are. Very much could be replaced with like. It's an exaggeration and it's an extra word that doesn't need to be there. The very is the extra word. I would advise, if you're going to write a book, just literally do a word search for the word very and go through the entire book and delete most of them. That's what I did when I was editing the beginning of Infinity. I went through a number of words and suggested deleting or changing them in many cases, and very was one of them. The other words were probability words, primarily, like likely and probable. And every time they were used metaphorically, instead of literally, I suggested changing them. I don't think you can reasonably expect people to learn a lot from this sentence that brings up the stock market. It's not explained. They're not guided through what the comparison is and how it works. Most people don't understand the stock market that well in the first place. And here they are asked to, on their own, like, know how the stock market works and then compare it to something else with very little guidance. Like, I think that this is more showing off. Like, I'm smart. I can see how lots of different things tie together, and I understand the stock market. I think that's what this sentence signals, rather than actually being very much used to readers. You could argue that it's meant for, like, 1% of the readers, that it's just there to help the top 1% of readers and screw the 99%. That's something that I might approve of in general. Like, I think it can be good to write for the best people, to, like, write for smart people. But this book is full of things that are not for the top 1% of readers. Like, it has lots of jokes and silly statements that are much more targeted to the bottom 90% or 99 or whatever. And I don't think it's good to have a bunch of statements that the 1% isn't going to like very much, and then also have some statements that only the 1% is going to like. Because then you have statements no one any given reader is not going to like some of the statements. Like, the book isn't optimized for anyone. It's kind of a compromise. But I don't think the purpose of this is to help the super smart readers, super knowledgeable readers. I think it's a very standard way of showing off. This whole paragraph is a bit confused. Like, it's not thematic enough. It's not organized well enough. It doesn't hold together well enough. Because, like, the brilliant strategy seems to be get with the top guy, but then it talks about strategies for identifying the top guy, which is different than the strategy of what you do about the top guy. Like, how you decide who the top guy is and what you do after you've decided are different issues. So there's a confusion in this paragraph. Alright, so the females shed their shells, soften up, and mate. They do sense near the lobster they want to mate with. Okay, so this is the end of the paragraph without the parenthetical. It just ends here. So this paragraph is like not thematic. Like this isn't a topic sentence. It is a like sequential description of what happens. Like it's this happens and then this happens. Oops. And then this happens. And then this is a little bit of commentary. But like it's sort of unclear what the purpose is. And then the next paragraph starts talking about chimp troops. So I have comments on 50 Shades of Grey, but I'm going to read the rest of this. So it's not exactly Beauty and the Beast. Like, I wonder if he's read it. So I have surveyed the book. I've read sections of it. It's really, really bad. I do not recommend it. Like, so I don't recommend it like for its own sake. It's not a good book. It's not well written. The plot's not well put together, etc. But it's interesting as like an artifact, as a thing that's popular, and you can wonder like why it's popular and what's going on with it. And what he's saying about it is not accurate, but I could see how you could think this from its general reputation. So she doesn't really tame him. Like, it's not a proper Beauty and the Beast story. Like, I've seen the Disney movie, and you're supposed to, like, win the beast over. But he's not really a beast, and he doesn't really get tamed. Um, it is a Mary Sue fanfiction story where she never has to do anything, and she has no real identity. Like, they want the female reader to be able to identify with the main character, so they never give her any traits that might not match the reader. So basically, she's like this complete empty shell with no traits, and gets everything she wants for no real reason and with no work done. They wouldn't want her to have to work for it, like actually taming the beast, because then it would work less well as a wish fulfillment fantasy. That would scare off readers who are like, oh, this book says I have to actually work to get a good guy. That sounds hard. So what the book does instead is say, a good guy will fall into your lap. And he'll be super rich. But he won't be a beast, he'll be super nice. He'll just be a beast in exactly the ways you want him to, at exactly the times you find it convenient, and no other way. Like, the guy is completely unrealistic, and he's this weird mix of, like, actual beta male behaviors that are not beastly at all, and, trying to be presented as high status. But he's not consistent about it. And then, like, the actual sex stuff is ridiculous because this is how little of a beast he is. He's like, I really want you. Here's my list of rules for our like BDSM sex or whatever that isn't really very hardcore. And so rather than her saying like, I don't want you to cut me, he says, I need you to sign these rules, which are, and every single rule is a limit on him that says, I won't cut you, I won't strangle you, and whatever else. And they basically take every single fear the girl might have, like, she's like, oh, kinky sex sounds nice, except this sounds scary. Or that sounds scary. Like, you take everything that a reader might be scared of. And then they have the guy say, I don't want to do any of those. Please sign a contract that they won't be done. And he, like, initiates not making any of them happen. It's so silly. Like, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable for him not to want to do those things, but like, where's the taming? He just, on his own initiative, says he doesn't want to do any of the things she might be scared of. It's everything is just handed to her. Which is the point. It's a wish fulfillment story where generic girl has everything handed to her for no reason. Even when the things are like somewhat contradictory and don't make sense. Just whatever's convenient in the moment is what she gets. Consistently every time. So, this is not an example story of someone being properly charmed at all. It's just wish fulfillment for females too lazy to properly charm a guy. Or too incompetent or whatever. Like, she's not actually good at it in the book. She's not good at anything. She doesn't do things well. And the guy is like a weird mix of like some high status behaviors and some things that are just convenient for her that are low status behaviors. That it's weird. It's also super blatant. Like, it's not very subtle or indirect about it. It makes everything like really simple, and it makes it hard to miss the dynamics. And I guess that makes it effective with like a very naive, simplistic audience that would have trouble picking up on more subtle signaling. So they just make the signals really blatant. And for a more intelligent person, that would ruin it, because it like pulls you out of the moment, and you're just like, oh, this is a bunch of social signaling and dominance hierarchy behavior. Like, if it's too blatant for your ability to detect such things, you're going to like see it for what it is instead of being taken in by it, and like it's going to get you out of the flow because you're analyzing it in like literal terms. So you need some level of subtlety. But the level of subtlety in this book is so low, and it's so popular, that it shows most people are just like really simplistic and see through social dynamics very little. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to say about the book is the sex he gets from her. I only read the first one, so maybe it escalates later. But basically the things he wants are things that you could get from someone you met at the bar yesterday. You don't need a contract. It doesn't take a bunch of like preparation and work and stuff. It's not that special or hardcore or anything to require so much build up, and it's just not that notable. Which makes it very weird that he would like fixate on her for no reason and then really want these easy to get things from her. Like, if he doesn't have abundance of those things already, that's completely incompatible with him actually being high status and rich and a charmer. Like, a socially savvy guy can get those things pretty easily without even being rich. Like, you can be poor and still get them pretty easily if you just are reasonably in the right age ballpark and like not horribly unattractive and are quite good socially at the social dynamics. So from this, I am suspicious that he hasn't read the book. If he did, that's like even worse, because it means that his ability to analyze things is questionable. Like, because I've seen him analyze stuff and thought he did a really good job, like Pinocchio and the Lion King. And he definitely knows how to analyze some types of things really well, and I learned a lot from that analysis. And so the two possibilities in my mind are primarily that either he didn't read 50 Shades of Grey and he's just going by some vague guesses based on reputation and secondhand short summaries or something. Which would be bad. He shouldn't be talking about it in his book in that case. Or alternatively, his ability to analyze things and understand social dynamics applies to Lion King and Pinocchio and various other things, but not to 50 Shades of Grey. Like, it works for some things and not others. And he doesn't know the difference. Like, he doesn't realize that he's missing more in some areas than others. I guess and other possibilities besides that are that I'm wrong. Maybe I analyzed it wrong. Or he could have read the book but not been in analysis mode. Like, sometimes people's ability to see into the depths of how things are working is something that they switch on and off. And it's possible he read 50 Shades of Grey in with a casual mindset, rather than with a very analytic mindset. So he could be capable, but he didn't use the capability. I'm questioning whether this is accurate because baby kissing is a symbolic gesture that isn't useful to the female, the mother. Like, it doesn't actually help raise her child. But I wonder if the attention paid to the females in animal societies with chimps or lobsters or whatever is actually like productive help, or rather than symbolism. Like, is it actually the lobster taking actions that help evolutionarily advance, like help with the survival value for the infants? Or is it just symbols that don't help at all, like baby kissing? I feel like those are two totally different things. And my guess would be, with the animals, that it needs to be actually useful behavior that has some evolutionary value. Otherwise, basically, the genes for the females wouldn't like recognize it as valuable and would be coded to look for a different guy or find different options or whatever if they weren't getting like actually useful attention. See, and this says lobsters are comparatively primitive. Why does it say still? Like, is he implying that lobsters are going to evolve into humans? Like, just give them another billion years and they'll get there. That's weird. Like, today, lobsters are comparatively primitive. What do you need to mention still for? Up to and including the present or the time mentioned. Right, that's weird because, like, they're still going to be comparatively primitive next year and the year after. So why would you specify, like, in the past and up to the present as if the future were going to be any different? Alright, well, that's weird. But the more important part here is the comparatively primitive, because this is trying to make it sound like there is some sort of sophistication spectrum, and humans and lobsters are both on the same spectrum, and humans are less primitive, and lobsters are more primitive, but they're doing the same kinds of things. That's like the overall theme and message here. It's the general gist of it. And I think that's false in a general way. So if you were very careful and you defined your spectrum really carefully and you said we're just comparing in this exact dimension, then you could probably find a spectrum where you could put lobsters and humans both on it and rate them in the same dimension, and then show that humans have, 50 times more than lobsters of whatever that specific attribute is. And you could maybe do this with several attributes, but there are lots of things where you couldn't do it because humans are dramatically different than lobsters. And so this sort of implies that overall you can put human sophistication and dating practices and social interactions on the same hierarchy as lobsters, just different by degree. And I don't think that's true. I think you can take like certain elements of it and make limited comparisons. But that's it. And I think that overall, the stuff he's talking about with the animal behavior is best viewed as a metaphor, as a loose illustration to help explain some things about humans, which is to some extent what he's using it for, but then he's also trying to say it has some literal accuracy. And I think there he's going wrong. So we tell stories about animals, and from these stories we can learn about ourselves. We can tell stories about animals that illustrate things about how our own society works. Like, we commonly do that even by accident because we see the world our way. So it makes sense that our stories about animals would be helpful for talking about human behavior. And the reason animal stories are good here is they're simplified. Like, you want simple examples. It's harder to just talk about like nightclubs and the dynamics there because they're very complex, and you want to have some like simpler cases to help introduce some of the concepts while not dealing with everything at once. So animal stories can help in terms of simplified examples, and if you just treat them as made up stories about anthropomorphized animals, then that would be okay. But Jordan Peterson is trying to have it both ways by using the animal stories and also trying to give them like scientific legitimacy, but then not actually being like really rigorous and careful about exactly what literally carries over to humans. Like the level of rigor is basically, here's some stories about animals that metaphorically we can draw some parallels with humans, and that would be fine. But then he's also trying to put in a bunch of science, and I don't like the mixing. I think he's doing this because he thinks it's true, but I think he's wrong, so we disagree. But like, even if he was right, a lot of the things I've been pointing out would still be good points. Like, even if he was actually right, like there's still statements that are unclear whether they're meant to be literal or not. And there's still definitely like jokes and unserious statements mixed in, and there's parts that lack rigor and so on, even if he's right about the overall issue. So like, this is silly because the female hardens up literally in terms of actually growing a shell. And that's not at all what human females do. Like, there's some sort of metaphorical comparison here, not a literal scientific comparison. And Jordan Peterson's not really carefully distinguishing between the two. Like, he's making all these comparisons without being very clear about what is being compared in what way. And some of the comparisons are of different types than others. Some are more broad than others. Some are more serious than others. And it's hard to tell even exactly quite what he means. Like, the vagueness seems to be in his own thoughts about it, or at least what he's managed to write down. Oh god, exponentially. People use exponentially all the time to mean a lot more, or big, or something. Like, what actual math formula is he talking about with what exponent in it? I don't like using this particular word in a unserious, casual way. It's very trendy lately because it brings the prestige of science, and specifically math, to what you're doing. It makes it sound more rigorous than it is. So I think it's dishonest signaling of how smart you are. And people don't give much thought to it. Like, they're terrible at math. They're not going to call you on it when you do it wrong. They just assume you know what you're talking about, and you're very impressive. And it's hard to call him on it, because, like, what does he actually mean? He wasn't precise enough to do the math. You can't check his work because he hasn't told you what his work is, so you just have to sort of trust him. Or, in my case, complain that he has used a common charlatan signal. And I think that really high-quality people would know this is a common charlatan signal and avoid it on purpose. Like, I would be wary of using this word even if it was accurate, because it is so strongly associated with charlatans right now. And his use of it makes me think that he hasn't noticed those people are charlatans and he's being taken in by a lot of fake scientists. And so that could explain a lot of what I've been reading, is there are other people who are charlatans and Jordan Peterson has not seen through them and has instead taken a bunch of their like semi-scientific claims as gospel, rather than more critically analyzing and seeing where they go wrong and where the weaknesses in their stuff is. Because like it's so bad, like so often when you hear exponential, it's just like wrong. Like people take like linear things and call them exponential all the time. Like exponential has a specific meaning, and people don't care what it is, but Jordan Peterson ought to care. Like, and especially he ought to care if he's going to try to have this book be like serious and actually true. Like if you're looking for the truth, you have to care about being accurate instead of just throwing around words that impress fools and are hard for fools to call you out on or catch errors in. So I think that this word is a really bad sign. It actually, I wonder if there were like editor influences in this. Like reading this so far, it doesn't seem to me to be quite the same style as his lectures. Like it doesn't feel like quite the same person to me. And I like his lectures more when I compare them. And I don't remember him ever using the word exponentially wrong. And I've seen like quite a lot of his lectures. So I wonder if it's possible that, you know, some editor from the book publisher was sprucing up his writing to impress more people by putting in words like this and making it dumber. And he let it happen. For the beginning of Infinity, David had an editor but made all the edits go through him, so nothing would get dumbed down. Like he had the final say on edits, which is really important if you want to write a serious book. I wonder what the process was for this book. Oh, and to give another example, so I wrote Hearthstone articles for a site called Liquid Hearth early on back in beta. And Team Liquid already had a bunch of editors and staff and structure and so on. And so they set up the website and I wrote some articles and they had editors who edited the text and they put in graphics and formatted them nicely and did all sorts of things to make them more popular, and they got hundreds of thousands of views. Whereas my blog gets like far fewer views than that. And the editors dumbed down my articles and they had final editorial control. I just let them. I just sent them the article and then they did whatever they wanted with it and posted it. Because it wasn't that big a deal. Like it wasn't my philosophy work. It was just Hearthstone strategy guides. If they dumb that down, like I don't care too much. Because it's not claiming to be like a really serious, important thing. So that they would absolutely have put a word like exponential into my article that I didn't write. And in that case, I let them because I didn't think it really mattered. But when you're writing like a serious intellectual scholarly book, when you're trying to seek the truth and get the ideas right, then things like this do matter. And if you let other people screw them up or you screw them up yourself, either way, it's pretty important. Okay, now this is dumb. Like, this is not good writing. This is not how he talks either. He doesn't like brag that there's an amazing number of reasons, which is like a silly way to brag. Like it's overstating it, and It's a fancier word than how people normally talk. Like, normally you just say for lots of reasons. But here we have an amazing number. So it's a little fancier, and that doesn't tell us how many. And it's just like, I'm right for lots of reasons. Like, why would you open by saying that? Normally you would just open with like actual reasons instead of there's lots of reasons I'm right. But the second half of the sentence is where it really gets worse. Is this comment about comically obvious is like, that means you should see a bunch of reasons that are really obvious why I'm right. Why the things I'm saying are relevant and true and important and how they matter and blah, blah, blah. And if you don't see those and agree with me and find them obvious, if you don't see them with like very little work, then you're the type of person who is so stupid they should be laughed at. So nod along and say you find it obvious too, or face massive ridicule. Like, he's playing in a quite mean way the social status games that he's in this chapter starting to talk about, and he's asserting his dominance over readers in this passage in a really insulting, condescending way that is pressuring people to pretend they agree more than they do. It is harming dissent. It is making it harder to be a critic of him. It's pushing people away from the truth and away from honesty by signaling in a very blatant way, if you aren't clever enough to find that I'm obviously right and see lots of reasons I'm right, then you suck. You're a bad human being. You should be laughed out of the in-group. Like, it's not subtle about that message. Like, the whole sentence doesn't even need to be here. It's just there to be mean to people and to brag. This is the kind of sentence you would never read in the 2015 Global Wealth Report, I think. I really hope it's not. And in the academic paper I was looking at earlier about the other type of lobster, that one was like all these serious sentences, and I would not have written this. And that's better. And George Reisman would not write this either, this blog post that I was pointing out earlier. Like, it's not super formal writing, but it isn't stuff like this either. Which is how my own blog is. Like, I write a lot of informal stuff, but I wouldn't have written this. Just in general, I never say anything's obvious. Like, that is a thing I avoid saying. Because the truth is not obvious, and people often have trouble figuring out the truth. And when they fail to figure out the truth, you should not insult them for missing the obvious. You should be sympathetic and say, right, it's not obvious. Like, it's completely possible to miss. And this gets into the theory of manifest truth, or obvious truth, same thing, which Karl Popper talks about. And what he pointed out is, if you think the truth is obvious, then anyone resisting the truth is a monster, a evil person who's resisting it on purpose. Because it's not that they missed it, it's not that the truth is hard to see, it's that they don't want it. Like, it's obvious they could see it if they wanted to, they're just rejecting the truth on purpose. So you start turning everyone who disagrees with you into a villain. People do this in more subtle ways. Like, they use the phrase "of course" a lot. You can indicate something is obvious using the words "of course." Like, you say, "of course this," "of course so-and-so." And that means it's obvious, and it has a very similar effect. So I avoid that as well. Try not to write "of course." There's rare cases where I think it's useful in some way, but the large majority of cases are just either unnecessary or actually like harmful, like this one. All right. Moving on. All right. Lobsters are old. 350 million years. That's a lot older than when dinosaurs went extinct. It's hard to imagine the past that far back. Dinosaurs were the new rich. This is another, like, brag. He's like, oh, I know French. I use fancy words that are hard for lay people to follow. And this is not how he talks in his lectures. He's not throwing in French terms. I think it's French. Like, I'm not very good at French. Yeah, French, literally new rich. Like, I've never taken French or anything. I was just sort of guessing. So it'd be somewhat hard for me to know that it's French instead of, like, Italian or something. Because, like, I really don't know much about Italian, so... Like, okay, it is in the dictionary, but it is a fancy French import that is not commonly used and is, like, in the form of French words instead of English words. And it's unnecessary, and it is... I think you get the idea. So this is not a very accurate statement. Like, the new rich in human society get, like, hazed a bit, treated differently. Like, there's a community of the long-term rich families that have some sort of social dynamics among them, and then when new people get rich, and they exclude poor people, or just even non-super rich people. And then when new people become rich, they're not automatically accepted into the culture of the existing rich people. However, that doesn't mean that they appear and disappear. Like, some of the new rich people become accepted and stay rich in the long term and become part of the old rich. It's not like they're just outsiders who appear and disappear. Like, some of them stay. So what the hell? Like, the dinosaurs disappeared, but that's not how the new rich work in general. I guess that these are, like, separate clauses and it's not supposed to apply. Like, the dinosaurs were X and the dinosaurs also did Y. I guess that's the structure. But, like, there's clearly some amount of linking. Like, it's easy to read it the way I did. So I think this is not good. But it's hard to tell how much it's a misconception or bad statement about human social dynamics around rich people culture versus just some, like, sloppy writing where they threw in this fancy term and then kept writing the sentence without even thinking about it anymore. It was just like a one-off toss-in. And, like, the flow of near eternal time. This is another just, like, throwing in a fancy phrase that is not helping clearly express useful ideas. And this is not my impression of how Jordan Peterson normally talks. Maybe he is in favor of trying to sound really smart. He just can't do it in real time to this degree. So when he sits down to write, then he sounds super smart. But when he's talking, then it's more casual and informal because he doesn't have time to think of all the proper fancy phrases. Like, maybe he knows how to signal how clever he is when he takes time to think of it, but he doesn't know how to do it, like, literally in real time fast enough to do it throughout his lectures. And maybe that's why his lectures are better than the book. Rather than him making his lectures more plain on purpose, it could just be inability to do it fast enough for the format. Which would be a little sad because, you know, I liked the lectures and was hoping that the style was intentional and something he thought desirable, but now I read the book and when he has more time to choose his words more carefully and gets to edit them, then he changed his style to one that I consider much worse, so maybe he thinks it's better. He is selling a lot of copies. This shit works. You can sucker a lot of people in with this and impress them, and they'll think you're smart, and they'll say they like you, and they will understand a fraction of what you said. And I don't think that's the right way to deal with the world. Because this statement, this thing is not helping clarify the truth to the average reader or to anyone. That's not its purpose. So if you're putting a bunch of effort into getting readers in non-truthy ways, some people have a lot of success with that in terms of actually getting readers, but that's totally different than actually helping them. A lot of people don't really know what's good for them and are attracted to things that are not maximally helpful. And I think they should be free to do that, of course, before anyone yells at me, but when I recognize some dynamics as not being good, then I steer clear of them. I don't say, oh, well, they did it voluntarily, therefore it's good. I use my own judgment. And if I think something's good and they think it's good, now we have common ground, and that's great. But, if they think it's good but I don't, I'm not going to provide it to them. This is a weird statement. Because, having some lobsters having dominance hierarchies on the bottom of the sea or whatever does not mean that it was affecting monkey evolution in a forest. It's saying dominance hierarchies are old, but that doesn't mean that they were widespread in the past just because lobsters had them a long time ago. On top of that, maybe dominance hierarchies evolved in lobsters 50 million years ago. Lobsters could be a lot older than some of their current behaviors. So, no. This is wrong. You don't get to say lobsters are old, that means dominance hierarchies are old, because lobsters today have dominance hierarchies. He has not stated at what time lobsters developed dominance hierarchies, so he might know that and he didn't mention it, but he didn't say, I know this. He said this means, referring to things he actually wrote. And the things he wrote do not mean it, so he's wrong. And the part where he makes it sound like all the life had to adapt to dominance hierarchies is not really. If your species has a dominance hierarchy, then it matters. And if other species do, then how exactly is that relevant? Well, so now he's saying that 350 million years ago, lobsters had dominance hierarchies. But that's not what he said above. He just said they existed. So, he's not keeping careful track of what he says. It's out of order. He says this means, and then he says the thing that means it. This means, and then the actual important stuff is in the next two sentences. And it's just a claim here with no footnote. And no recognition that it is non-obvious. And, you get the impression that he thinks they must have had it just because they existed. So let's check the site. The emergence of lobsters, phylogenetic relationships, morphological evolution, and divergence time comparisons of an ancient group. 2014. Okay, the paper's available. Good start. Alright, I'm gonna read this abstract. Lobsters are economically important. Does he mean that like we sell like millions of dollars of lobster in restaurants per year? Or is he talking about something else? Okay, so this is saying there's lots of different types of lobster and they're hard to categorize and like figure out which are related to which and how they evolved. And rich fossil history allows estimating different divergence times. And they estimated the origin of the first lobster-like decapod. And I don't know how to read this date exactly. Maybe MA is just like million annums. With an implication of like ago. MA and geochronologists speak is exactly equivalent to BCE. You're not specifying a duration, you're specifying a period of time between two dates. Anyway, so yeah, it means millions of years ago. Okay, so why did he use 350 when it says 409 to 372? Is he just being conservative? Or is he just sort of ignoring the paper? Or is he talking about these other ones? With all infra orders present in 350 to 318. Maybe he's like fudging it between the two different numbers. But he said in one form or another, so it seems like he could just use the earliest date. So why did he use 350 instead of 409? Or, you know, rounding to 400? That's strange. And then he rounds it to 1/3 of a billion, so 333. I wonder if he just used a lower number so that he could then round it to a third conveniently instead of 2/5. Probably not. I hope not. Maybe there's like details in the paper. Or here it says 360. So it's weird to say like economically important dating back and then talk about like them going super far back, because the economic importance, if you talk about like lobster restaurants, is like very recent. So it seems sort of irrelevant to like the vast majority of lobster history. It says billions of dollars each year in the international economy for human consumption and the aquarium trade. Okay, so they are talking about like lobsters matter now, but then we're gonna date them super far back. Anyway, so does this paper talk? It didn't say anything in the abstract about dominance hierarchies. Dominance, no. Higher, no. Social? 1. Lobsters are not only economically important, but also contribute to culture, livelihood of many communities. Oh, this is talking about human social activities. Okay, so the one use of the word social is about human social activities. So this does not say lobsters had dominance hierarchies 350 million years ago. It says lobsters existed 350 million years ago. It does not say when they evolved dominance hierarchies. So this is just a bad site. This is wrong. This is very sloppy scholarship. Like, this is not okay. Like, I like the guy, but this is not cool. This is like a major scholarship error. This is the kind of thing that makes you not trust any of the facts in the book. And by the way, most books are like this. Like, this is not egregiously bad. Like, you just cannot trust the sites in most books. But it's like sad that Jordan Peterson is falling into that category. Like, this is not the first citation problem I've found, and I haven't looked at very many. And that's just normal. But as normal as it is, that doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't mean you should start trusting the scientific claims in the book. Like, I'm sure some of the scientific claims in the book are true, but it's very hard to guess which are which, and without actually checking the sites yourself, which means that you just sort of can't trust any of them, which is sad and makes it hard to read the book and get value from it, because you're like distrusting all the factual claims. So to get value from the book, you have to take it more loosely and see if any of the conceptual ideas are useful to you, which is fine, and you can definitely get value that way. But the book is certainly putting significant attention into science-like factual stuff that is just not useful, because you can't trust it and you have to check all the sites yourself. And then you'll just find that some of them are wrong and have to figure out your own conclusions, and you might as well just survey the literature yourself in the first place and skip the book if you're trying to come at this from a scientific perspective. And that's harsh, but like, I think it's fair anyways. This is like exaggerated and silly, and it's like a bit of a cliche to use this phrase, like that something's hard to overstate. It's like the word exponential, except not as common. But it is a thing I've noticed a number of people doing in order to sort of brag and sound smart. It's a meme that's been going around. And it's not a very intellectual one. It's not optimized for communicating useful information. It just means this is important, but it's in fancy words. And there are certain foolish readers, and maybe there's a lot of them, who will be more enthusiastic about your book if you phrase it this way, even though it's worse, and will more often recommend it to their friends with more energy, and will be more inclined to go watch your videos after reading, because they're like impressed enough to bother following up. So it's a social manipulation. It's not truth-seeking. It only works on the dumber part of the audience. I don't like it. So this is going pretty slow. I've gotten through three more sections. There's still like a bunch more. The nature of nature. I'm sort of planning to speed up, but like, I want to comment on these things, so it's not really happening. And it takes like attention to detail to actually figure out what's going on. Like, if I had not looked up some of the citations, I would have missed things. Like, it's a big deal to find that I actually checked some of the sites and they were wrong. Like, this one is just, I mean, so the site is only on the 350 million years, and for that it is fine, but it gives you the impression that this other claim in the same paragraph that's closely related would actually be scientific and true and stuff. And you would expect that the one site in the paragraph on a relevant related thing would actually apply to it, but it doesn't, and this is just an empty claim with no citation, where a citation is badly needed. Like, it could be true, but he seems to just think it is true. Like, he says this means after this other thing, as if the 350 million years age implies 350 million years old having a particular characteristic. So it seems like a logical error. So I guess you could say it's a little different than a cite error, but like it's kind of hard to differentiate the related issues. If you're making logical mistakes, then you're going to misuse cites or use them in misleading ways or whatever. And so the things that are like factual claims that have cites near them are not trustable if the author is making logical errors or citation errors, either way. Right, things only change when there's enough selection pressure for the change to actually be important. Because like only so much stuff can get more adapted at once. Like there can only be so many mutations before you just get chaos. And the more important mutations, well, like if one animal has a super important mutation that makes a huge survival difference, and another one has a positive mutation that makes a much smaller difference, the one with the big difference can then breed more and dominate the gene pool. And so even the positive mutation, when it wasn't important enough compared to an available other mutation, could just sort of get ignored or, not matter evolutionarily. So why is the word now here? Like, evolution worked the same way in the past as the present. So I don't think this now refers to time. I think it's just like an empty word like you might use when speaking. Like sometimes people will throw in now when they're talking, and they'll just say now this, now that. It's less common in writing. And if you are going to do that, it would be more common with a comma after it. You would say like now, because it's just like an introduction. So if the introduction is you're saying now as an introduction, you should put a comma after it. Now, and then you go on. But it's like now evolution works. Like this is not good writing. Oh, this comma is not even like an introduction phrase comma. It's just for offsetting this. So now evolution works through variation and natural selection. Okay, I'm saving the sentence. That now is bad. Like, you just delete the word now and you have a better sentence. Like, you can look up meanings, like at the present time or moment. That is not a meaning we want here, because it works in the past and future like that. Right, under the present circumstances. No, it works in the past circumstances as well, and it will work in various future circumstances. Right, used to draw attention to a particular statement or point in a narrative. Like now, my first impulse was to run away. I think this might be the use he's going for, but I'm going to keep reading. It's not a request, instruction, or question. Oh, does she now? Ironic. Okay. Now that. Nope. Okay, so it's... If it makes any sense, it's got to be this one. Like I was saying, that you can write kind of like this, and it's more common in speaking. So it's trying to draw attention, like that makes sense, but you can see in the examples there's a comma after it, because it's like an introductory phrase that's drawing attention, and then you move on to the actual thing, and it's separate. The phrase, to put it simply, is bragging. It means I know something you don't. I'm fancier than you, and it starts to imply I'm an authority and you should start taking my words for things because I've gone into all the detail about what gene shuffling is and you haven't, so trust me. And it's unnecessary. You could just delete this and the sentence would be alright. It's not a great sentence, though, because exists for many reasons is kind of vague. Like, does this mean it's caused by these, or, like, there's other things it could mean, like, is not, like, you could have reasons that it is not destroyed, like, it sticks around once it exists, or you could have reasons it's caused in the first place. And, like, there's different levels of analysis and different types of variation that you could be referring to. So it's hard to tell what the point of the sentence is or what it's supposed to mean. And it has like this nasty bragging in it. Okay, so individuals vary within a species because of random mutation? Sure. That accounts for some variance. Like, a lot more variance is not from random mutation. Or at least not directly. Like, it's not like... If we're talking about random mutation as in there was a random mutation when I was getting my DNA from my parents, a lot of variation is not from that. Like, most of the ways I'm different than some other person were ways my parents were already different, so it wasn't just a mutation when I was born. Nature chooses among them. Okay, so this is like humanizing nature, as if nature were a person who makes choices. So it's a little sloppy. It's convenient though. Like, I've used this kind of language at times. You have to be careful with it because it's not literal. And so first he's like, oh, I'm so fancy, I know that gene shuffling is like only a simple version. But then he just carelessly says nature chooses and does not put in parentheses to put it metaphorically. Like, this is the one where you actually a qualifier would be more beneficial to the reader here. If you say nature chooses parentheses to put it metaphorically. To like warn them that this is actually a common way people talk about it, which is somewhat misleading. But he doesn't do that. And this makes it seem like he's being really precise, just like the 220 footnotes do. But then when he says nature chooses, he's not precise. Also, if gene shuffling is important, and this is to put it simply, why doesn't he put a footnote here with a reference where the reader can learn more? Why isn't he using his footnotes to help the reader? Like, if this is the simple version and it actually matters, the difference between the simple version and the non-simple version matters, why not give someone a reference to get more information? The way he uses references is to try to put authority on some of his claims. Like, I claim this as a fact, here's some authority to back me up, rather than here's like further reading that would be useful to you. So I think there's like a underlying attitude problem there, which is super common. But it's not ubiquitous. Like, if you go to so this is a blog that writes about primarily Apple, and so occasionally he writes like really long posts with a lot of info, and most of the posts are short. And so when you click archive, I think you get the long ones, and they have footnotes reasonably often, and the footnotes are not, usually here's proof of my fact. Usually they are like extra explanations and useful info that a reader would actually like appreciate, rather than an authority to try to make him harder to argue with. So some people use footnotes in good ways, and like I actually read his footnotes regularly. He just puts like extra details in footnotes so they don't clutter up the main body of the text, as common. And like that's what he could have done here, is he could have put extra details or a URL where you can get them, or a book reference or something, in a footnote instead of cluttering up the main text, because he didn't have space to tell us more about gene shuffling here. That's what a footnote's for. But instead he just, signals that he's much smarter than this, but then doesn't give any extra info. God, this makes it sound like he's so smart that he realized there was one more question. But, like, this was such an abbreviated thing that, of course there are dozens more questions lurking under the surface here. But he just has readers, like, nodding along, and then he's like, but there's one more question. And they're like, oh, I was just nodding along. I didn't even think of a question. You're so smart. Appears to account for, but. Like, no. What do you mean as stated? Do you mean, like, as stated by serious writers in more serious books, or as stated in the start of your paragraph? Like, does as stated refer to this, or does it refer to, like, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, or something more like that, or an even more scholarly book than that? And, like, appears, no, it does account for it. Like, are you questioning evolution, or are you just trying to sound a certain way, or? Like, there is a theory, and it accounts for the observed data. Not appears to account for, like, does account for. That doesn't prove that it's what happened. Like, you can have multiple things that account for the data, and only one of them is what happened. But you don't say they appear to account for it. Like, they do account for it. Like, a particular theory, even if it's not what happened, can still account for the data. And you just end up rejecting it when you find some other data that it doesn't account for, or a logical error in it, or something else. So this is a little silly. So there's another question lurking under the surface, which means I'm smart enough to go under the surface. I'm not superficial, I'm deep. What is the nature of natural selection? So, like, he uses nature chooses. Like, he's being imprecise and careless and metaphorical. And then he's like, I'm so precise, I quote words and, like, look into what nature means. Like, that's not very reasonable. Like, he could have written it more precisely in the first place if he was going to be picky, but it's like, he wrote it kind of not that great himself. And then he's like, look, we can go into more details and be picky about this. It's like, yeah, that's your own fault. Like, you can state the theory of evolution without mentioning nature, right? Like, better theories of evolution, or more precise ones, typically talk about replicators, and they do not talk about nature or choosing or natural selection or survival of the fittest. Those are all, like, no words, because of their imprecision and metaphoricalness and difficulty of pinning down the details of exactly what you're talking about. So there's more precise things you can talk about. So he introduces the imprecise topics and then says there's a question lurking under the surface, and starts questioning his own not great statement of evolution. And it's not like you have to write a really long thing to make it better. Saying that evolution works by replication with variation and selection is short. You don't have to say natural. And, like, this is actually, worse, because evolution is more general than genetic evolution in nature. This rules out mimetic evolution, because memes are not selected via natural selection, by which he means things like predators eating other animals. Or, that's what I figure he means. What exactly is the environment to which animals adapt? So he's only thinking about biological evolution, rather than the more general theory of evolution, which applies to replicators of whatever type, memes being a important example. And that's actually really notable that he's neglecting memes in this way, because memes are the solution, or an important facet of a lot of issues he talks about where he overstates the role of biology. Like, I have a disagreement with him on a certain theme, and my side of the issue is, hey, memes play a big role here, and you're not talking about that, and you're just assuming that you thought of some other cause, so it must be that, while not addressing, do memes account for this? Would that make sense? Etc. Like, they're just being kind of neglected instead of refuted. And so here we have him neglecting memes again, and when he's trying to talk about evolution directly rather than talking about some other field, and the evolution is like receiving less attention. It's like when he puts his attention directly on the topic of evolution, he's still just saying evolution works by variation and natural selection, as if evolution is not a thing that applies to replicators in general and can't apply to memes. Like, has he never read The Selfish Gene? Because if he hasn't, he should not be writing about evolution in this book. Like, you shouldn't be a public intellectual, publishing a book where you claim to be a smart person who knows what they're talking about, and then you write about it. You write in the book about a topic where you don't know what you're talking about. Like, if he either needs to have read The Selfish Gene or like the equivalent or better material in some other way. But he seems to not have reached that bar. In which case, if you don't know enough about the topic, don't write about it in your book. So, eon means a long time. And I think he used it because it sounds smart, maybe? I don't know. I think millennia would be better because that gives you more of a accurate ballpark. Or, not millennia. That's thousands, isn't it? What's millions? The prefixes are like similar. Oh, so the word million actually just comes from the mille prefix for thousand, and they just threw on a suffix. That's so confusing. Okay, maybe it's really awkward to just say something that means millions of years, so maybe that's a good reason to use eons. What exactly is the environment to which animals adapt? Like, literally the environment they live in. Like, the situation the animal is in is the one it adapts to. I don't think that that's terribly confusing or unclear. And the nature in natural selection is like your own imprecision and misconceptions. Like, logically, some replicators are better at replicating, so they make more copies, so then there's more of them in the next generation. That doesn't require like some nature as like force of nature controlling things. There's no nature choosing. There's no choice by nature. Nature's not an agent. It's just the laws of physics and logic and so on imply things. That's all it is. So you can keep nature out of it. And now we're just like pivoting into accusing the reader of overestimating their knowledge, and like it's sort of saying to the reader, you think you know about evolution, but there's more subtle questions, and clever me is now going to teach you about it, except that he's not doing a very good job. So that's kind of condescending without earning the right to say that. So that's kind of fake. Like, he's pretending to know more about evolution than he does. Like, I'm sure he knows more about it than what comes across in this paragraph, but if he knew about it well enough, then he wouldn't write this paragraph. Like, whatever extra stuff he knows didn't help him realize this was a bad paragraph. So it's inadequate in some way. It's easy to assume nature is something within nature, something static. But it's not, at least not, it's static and dynamic at the same time. Sure, the environment changes. But it's not the environment that selects, it's selection happens when you put together like all the pieces. Like, the environment is not an active agent either. And what is selected is not controlled entirely by the environment. It's like the internal logic of the animal also matters. And like, there are evolutionary advantages that don't directly have a lot to do with the environment, but matter for some other logical reason that has nothing to do with like whether you're in a rainy environment or a sunny environment. Like, there are certain animal traits that do better or worse depending on the weather. So that's a part of the environment that we could say selects for those particular traits. But there are other traits that are closer to universally better and worse, rather than having a lot to do with the particular environment. And there's I think a good example is the dominance hierarchy stuff. Like, the way that lobsters fight over territory is not environment specific. It's an adaptation that helps them live in communities with other lobsters. Not exactly communities, but like live in the same area as other lobsters and not like all kill each other, and it works reasonably well. And so that's not being selected by the environment so much as by the logic of this way of interacting with other lobsters works better than other ways of interacting with other lobsters across tons and tons and tons of different environments. Now, you could probably design some custom-made environment where it doesn't work, but it works across tons of environments. So it's not really the environment, like, it's not this environment is against that one that selected it, because it works in both. The bigger picture is just when you have like the lobster, the environment, the other lobsters, which you might call part of the environment. When you just put it all together with the laws of physics and everything, then you get a result. However, and slicing it up into categories like the environment is a human mental construct to categorize things and try to organize them for our benefit. And Jordan Peterson is treating it more like a fact of reality that's really important to be precise about. But like, normally if you're trying to be precise about these things, the lobster's body itself is part of the environment of the gene. Like, it's you look at specifically the genes are the replicators, and then what is the environment of the gene. You don't look at the environment of the lobster, because you don't look at lobsters, you look at genes, if you want to be precise. So he's looking for some sort of middle ground and then pretending he's being ultra precise. But he's not doing it in the standard way to be more precise with these things. Every death is a metamorphosis? Well, that's poetic, but what the fuck? I mean, it's a change literally, like, it was alive and now it's dead. But, like, metamorphosis is not just a generic word meaning change. It's like transformation into a new form. Like, metamorphosis is more normally applied to, like, a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, not a butterfly becoming dirt because it died. So this is strange. It's getting very metaphorical in this paragraph. We're talking about like Taoists and the yin and yang symbol, and the black serpent chaos has a white dot in its head. Because chaos and order are interchangeable. Wait, no? Like, sort of, but no? Like, it matters which one you have. They're different. It is possible to change some chaos into order, or vice versa, but that doesn't mean they're interchangeable. Like, okay, $50 is not interchangeable with $20, even though it is possible to like lose $30 or make $30. That doesn't make them interchangeable. Interchangeable means they're like equal, or like it's very easy to change them. Like apparently identical, very similar. It doesn't just mean that there's some possible way to change from one to the other. Like, it's like calling lead and gold interchangeable, because once we invent transmutation technology, we'll actually be able to change lead into gold and vice versa. Because we know, or at least think, that that will be possible, because lead and gold are both made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So it should, in theory, be possible to rearrange those same building blocks into different configurations. And we know that is possible in some cases, but we cannot yet do it in this particular case. Oh, and we also know that something along those lines actually happened in history. Not specifically led into gold, but like basically the universe started with protons and electrons and neutrons being just all split up. So like they weren't formed into atoms yet, and then hydrogen formed first because it's the simplest one. It's just one proton and one electron. And then, later some helium formed out of hydrogen, and you get the simpler elements earlier on, and later, basically due to nuclear fusion in stars, we got some of the heavier elements made. And it's something along those lines. So like the heavier elements like lead and gold both came out of other types of atoms that managed to get combined. Like some protons from one atom ended up like fusing into a different atom to make an atom with more protons, so you can get to some of the bigger elements. Anyway, that certainly doesn't make them interchangeable. That's just silly. I'm gonna save this sentence. There is nothing so certain that it cannot vary. This is just getting into like poetry instead of science. And we're like, he just said that we have to be careful with our assumptions about nature. We have to be careful about what exactly is nature. We have to be more precise about evolution. And now he's just talking about Taoism and serpents and making poetry statements instead of following up with like actual scientific details. Like it sounded like he's like, okay, now I'm going to tell you novices the details about how evolution works, and then he just didn't. Maybe he does that later, but it's like really, there's something strange about this transition. He does say first, so it's like there's going to be multiple points. But he's just like, things are changing a lot all the time, and there's chaos and order, and things vary, and like nothing is so certain that it cannot vary is like also strange. Like it would sort of make more sense to say nothing is so like strong and impermeable and resistant to all attempts to poke and prod it that it can't change. But like certain talks about human certainty. It's like a way of thinking. Like, so this sort of means nothing is so nothing has so much human confidence behind it to prevent it from varying, but it's not certain. It's not human certainty that prevents things from varying. We feel certain about things staying the same when we have reasons, when we understand reasons that they won't vary. The reason being, that is a strong material, so even if it sits there for 100 years, it won't change much. So I definitely don't expect it to change, during the next 5 years, which is what I care about. You have reasoning like that. It's not your certainty that prevents it from varying. It's you are certain because you understand some reason it wouldn't vary, and the reason is something else, not your certainty itself. So this is really not good. Even the sun has its cycles of instability. Well, that's a very silly comment, because the sun is going to... it has a lifetime. Like, we only have a few billion years left before we don't have a sun anymore. It's gonna blow up or something. Like I'm not an expert on astrophysics at all, but the most prominent feature of the sun's instability is not that it has like cycles and hot spots or whatever, which is true. Like the prominent thing is it is literally burning fuel and running out. It's going to take a long time, but it is not a stable thing in any way. The sun is like inherently a super unstable thing. It is a one-way process. It's not like it's a renewable resource in the long term. Like if you think about like what a sun is, maybe there's a way to make new suns. I don't know. Maybe we'll invent that technology in the future. But like the existing suns that exist right now, are just all in the process of destroying themselves. There's nothing so mutable that it cannot be fixed. Like, this is such a weird mix of poetry and science. Like, he's talking about the sun, and like, the sun is a major topic of science. It's also a topic of poetry, sure, but like, it is significantly associated with science in the history of science. Which is like the way I read it initially. Maybe he was in and the context here is science because we're talking about evolution, though he did abruptly change for this paragraph. So is he thinking about the sun in a more metaphorical way? Like, if you think about it from like the primitives' perspective, like the ancients, people who don't have science, what does the sun look like? Well, it is differently bright on different days, and it moves around and disappears for a while. So that's not very stable looking. Like the fact that it keeps coming back, there's astability to it, but it's not just like a super stable thing. It's a thing with elements of stability and instability. So you shouldn't use it as like a paragon of stability because it's a thing that disappears on a daily basis. You might say that the overall overarching pattern of the sun is itself something very stable, but that's different than saying the sun is stable. Like if you said the pattern of night and day has a lot of stability on an annual basis, so you can factor in the seasons, then sure, there's a lot there, though it's very far from perfectly stable. So this is not great thinking here. Like this isn't super well thought through. There's a bit of confusion. Every revolution produces a new order. I mean, if you change something, you get something else, so sort of, but like, this is silly, this is not helpful. And it doesn't necessarily produce a new order, it produces a new something, like, because we're talking about order and chaos, like, some revolutions produce chaos, right? So in the context of order and chaos, many revolutions do not produce order, they produce chaos. But in the totally different sense of the word, where order means state of affairs rather than like orderly state of affairs, like it produces some sort of state of affairs. Like order has two meanings and he's using different meanings in the same paragraph, or else this is wrong. See, if order means the arrangement or disposition of people or things in relation to each other, then sure, like even chaos is order by that definition. Well, it does say according to a particular sequence, pattern, or method, but nothing is so chaotic that you couldn't call it a sequence or pattern of some sort. Like, pattern's not a very well-defined word. This gets into subtleties, though. But hopefully you can understand the point that, like, order can mean, like, a situation, a state of affairs, like, an order of some sort. Like, any situation can be called some sort of order, but then there's, like, the ones that are more or less orderly. And revolutions often produce situations that are highly chaotic. So it's misleading to call that a new order. Serious errors of apprehension. Like, this is just very prestige-y writing, trying to be impressive and sound clever. Like, if you do this, you will do fancy mistakes. Like, it's not, if you do this, you're dumb. It's, if you do this, it will passive voice produce. Considering produces. It's not like you produce errors. It's not your fault. It's weasel words. Doing this produces that. Like, it's taking the human agency out of it. He doesn't say, like, this is wrong. He's saying it somehow produces this. And, like, there's this weird mix. Like, serious errors makes it less nice, but then it's, like, really hedged against offending the reader. So it's like, this makes it more offensive, but then, like, the way it's phrased makes it less offensive. And it's like doing both at once, which I find strange. Like, it's not really optimized for non-offense, because then you would just delete serious. This is an example of, like, an unnecessary intensifier word. It doesn't give you a good idea of degree. Like, it's not actually communicating amounts in any meaningful, quantifiable way. It just means a lot. And in general, there are reasons to say a lot, but usually you don't want to. You just let the reader judge how much. And because when you say a lot or, like, big errors, people are just like, well, how big? How big do you mean? Like, it doesn't communicate what size you have in mind. So it's not very useful. I don't know what errors Jordan Peterson considers serious. Like, the reason he's writing it is not to communicate a level of severity of error in a useful way. He's writing serious errors to mean, like, if you don't pay attention to these errors, you're fucked. They're serious business. Like, he wants you to listen. He's, like, trying to get attention. But it's not an argument. It's not persuasive. It's not carefully explaining in a clear way a thought process that tries to seek the truth. Anyway, all this means is if you think that, like, the weather will be the same every single day, then you'll get things wrong. Which, like, it's not very deep, actually. It's a simple point, and I don't even know who he's arguing with. I've never heard of anyone arguing this. Like, there's probably people who just sort of, like, weren't thinking very much and didn't think about it, but like, you know, winter and summer are changes in environment. No one thinks winter and summer don't exist. And, like, people know that there have been ice ages where, like, the temperature was way colder. And that there's potentially, supposedly, allegedly, global warming where the temperature keeps going up. So the situation is not static. Everyone knows that it's possible for the temperature to go up over time. That is a thing that could happen whether or not it is happening. So, you know, it's not like the world is static, therefore the temperature will always be the same. Like, we know it could change, maybe. And we know it has changed in the past, and those things are well known. So Jordan Peterson's being kind of condescending here, while actually not saying something very important. Or the point doesn't really live up to the hype. So nature selects. Now he's using scare quotes, like, the idea of selects contains implicitly nested within it the idea of fitness. It is fitness that is selected. That is not a very good way to put it. Like, I would recommend not putting it that way. Like, I talk about evolution frequently, and fitness is not a word that I tend to bring into the discussion. It's generally more of a word I would avoid on purpose rather than bring up on purpose. And it's also just one that doesn't seem useful to me enough that it would come up very often. Like, I don't often, like, think of saying it and stop myself. I usually just don't think of saying it in the first place. Roughly speaking, it's better to say the grandchildren than offspring, or maybe great grandchildren. Like how many children an organism has is not as good an approximation as how many grandchildren. I'm pretty sure. Matching of attribute to demand. Does he mean attributes? Like, is that a typo? He's writing it so fancy that it's hard to tell, but I think it's just a typo. I think that if it's singular, it needs an article. You need to say the attribute, or more realistically, an attribute. Like you could say the matching of an organismal attribute to environmental demand, or you could say attributes. Errors like this is not a random error. Like some typos are pretty random, and it's just like, oops, he hit the wrong button, and somehow it got missed. Getting missed by editors decreases the randomness. Like which typos stand out? The typos that stand out more get preferentially edited out. But so why did this particular typo get missed? It is because this is a very fancy, hard to read sentence with this like fancy word, and it's a fancy structure, and it's just like overwhelming to people, and it's trying to impress the reader with how fancy it is. It's trying to be really clever, and when you do that, it is fucking distracting, and people like lose track of what you're saying, to the extent that they don't even recognize when you needed a plural or a singular. Like they're so lost that they miss this typo is what I'm trying to say. And it's because of the content of the sentence being confusing to people. Like when you're losing your own editors because you're writing fancy, so that they like lose track of things enough to miss simple typos. That's because they're like having trouble with the content, and that is an indication that, you know, most of your readers are going to have trouble with the content, because whoever's doing like editing to look for typos is going to be like way smarter and more knowledgeable about this kind of stuff than your typical reader. So it's really not good when you're confusing things enough to cause your editors to have trouble following. It's also not good that editors are not always that good at recognizing when they're lost and then going back and like triple reading it and being really careful and analyzing it. Like to some extent, editors, just like the public, are just like, oh, it's a smart sentence, good job, and they just keep reading without like actually trying to fully understand it and break it down into what it means. And then, because if they had really thought it through, then they should be able to see the typo. He's using all these quotes like he's being super precise, but this is not even close to a optimal or highly precise way of explaining evolution. So there's a mismatch between presentation and substance. Like he's trying to present it like this is really, really advanced, great substance, and he's being really careful, and that is not true. This is a popularized, somewhat sloppy introduction to evolution. It's just not super duper intellectual, but it has all these fancy intellectual words that make it harder to understand. So that's bad. And that is quite different than it actually being really, really serious. Well, there is evolutionary progress. Like, environmental changes are not just random chaos. There's been a progression of more and more knowledge, and it's not, the knowledge is not all environment specific, as I was talking about earlier. Like, evolution doesn't just create knowledge that works in this exact environment that's super fragile, and the moment there's a different environment, it all falls apart. That can happen, like, that is possible, but biological evolution has created things with a lot more flexibility that can deal with the changing environment. So that is the type of progress, is not just the ability to solve the problems in the current environment, but the ability to solve the problems in different environments if they come up, is a thing that biological evolution has created in a substantial amounts of. Which is part of why I was saying it was misleading to talk about the environment selecting, because evolution has created this sort of meta-knowledge that transcends its environment. And if you want to know why that happens and more about that, I would recommend the book The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch, and to read about the reach of ideas. Reach is what he calls it when knowledge is able to apply more widely. Like the broader applicability of the knowledge, the more different scenarios, questions, situations it works for, the more reach. And reach is like a very important idea in the field of the philosophy of knowledge. And it's very important for understanding evolution and human thinking and all kinds of things. And I will put the book in the YouTube description. So if you're interested. And also if you like these kinds of things, just you can read my stuff and you will find these kinds of ideas. Including I've written stuff about reach before. You could search my blog and find something. Search on reach or applicability and you should find some stuff. And it's also the kind of thing you can ask at our discussion group. For the discussion group, you go to the Fallible Ideas website and then discussion group. Or you can just post in my blog comments. And you can post on old blog posts. It's not like one of those blogs where no one ever replies unless it's one of the latest 10 posts or something. You can post on an 8-year-old blog post and get replies. Doesn't really matter how old it is. Which I think is important because I write about reasonably timeless ideas fairly often. Not all the time, but a decent amount of what I write is trying to talk about logic and abstract principles and the kinds of things that don't go out of style in 8 years or even 500 years. I'm trying to get at deeper truths than the current situation. And yeah, so the book is called The Beginning of Infinity, and there's a number of meanings to what the beginning of infinity is, but the sort of overall theme is the beginning of infinite progress. Humans can make infinite, unbounded progress, and that is a journey that we should embark on rather than doing things like questioning progress. Progress is a legitimate, important idea, which Jordan Peterson is in some limited way disparaging. And this exact idea is actually very wise because biological evolution lost a lot of its importance once man was created. Man is the pinnacle of biological evolution, and man transcends it because biological evolution got to the point of creating general intelligence. And then once general intelligence existed, mimetic evolution, the evolution of ideas, which is how intelligence works, I believe, from studying epistemology and so on, is by evolution of ideas. That's how intelligent thought works. And I don't think there's any rivals that address the issues, but that's another topic. Anyway, so meme evolution is now more important than biological evolution. So there was a pinnacle, and now biological evolution has substantially lost importance because we have so much control over the environment, like building houses and whatever. We don't need to grow fur if it's cold. We can just turn on the heater. So we alleviate selection pressures whenever we can solve some problem with our ideas, then we can alleviate the selection pressure before genes get to meet that selection pressure. So the genes don't get to evolve anymore in general. The animals are still like evolving a bit, but like none of them rival us. And I mean, it's conceivable that like another intelligent species will evolve, so then we won't be like alone at the pinnacle. But it doesn't seem to be currently happening, or on the verge of happening or anything. So the situation as man is quite different than all the other animals. Man's at a pinnacle, and like it really is a pinnacle. It's not just man got this far and in the future man will get further. It is biological evolution got man this far, and now memes and thinking and tools and whatever have taken over, leaving much less of a role for biological evolution. So it is kind of the pinnacle, and then the biological evolution progress kind of stopped there, and we started working on other kinds of progress. So disagree. Produces the erroneous notion that there's a destination. Well, so to some extent there is, like lobsters were a destination of sorts. But if you mean like one single final destination that will be unchanging no matter how the environment changes, then that's not the right way to think of it, sure. But like organisms can get more adaptable, so that they're better at dealing with the current environment as well as changing environments, and that is a sort of meta pinnacle, a higher level type of fitness that evolution has created some of, and you can imagine like further increases in that. Not everything is just like fractured into different frameworks, and it's not like every environment is just a separate chaotic thing with no continuity of what traits are valuable. There's reach of traits to be valuable across different environments. And there is a thing, an observed thing, that's goes something like this. Good design in the current environment commonly, when solving a hard problem, works in a way that it works across many environments, has some like flexibility or reach. It's hard to know exactly why that is, or how broadly it applies, or like when it does and doesn't apply, but it is a like observed theme that seems to be quite common, is good design to solve hard problems creates knowledge with some generality that will then solve many problems and deal with many situations or environments or whatever. So I think that the book has the wrong perspective on these things. Nature is not a static selection. See, nature is not an agent. Like, this is... He's trying to be all precise. He's like, fitness. But then, why is an agent in scare quotes? Why wasn't nature chooses in scare quotes? Like, nature is not an agent. That is so imprecise, I would not write that. And it's in the midst of him saying how we're naive and he's clever and here's a bunch of fancy words to tell us in more detail what evolution knows what evolution means because we don't know about it well enough. And I really don't like the mix of like condescending and clever with sloppy and wrong. Like, if it was all just sort of approximate and presented that way, that would be okay, and then I wouldn't pick on the word agent because it's like reasonably in the ballpark and you can understand it. But when you present yourself as being precise and then you say something that's imprecise, that's misleading. You shouldn't put those together. Nature dresses differently for each occasion. So now we're just getting into, like, this is a clear metaphor, but, like, agent was not a clear metaphor or approximation. Whereas, like, dressing is is clearly like, he's not saying that nature literally wears clothing, so that one's like clearly a metaphor, but the other one's not. So he just goes back and forth, and it's hard to tell which are which. Nature varies like a musical score, another metaphor, and a different one. Another thing with metaphors and examples in general is you want to try to not use too many. Like, just switching them all the time is confusing. It's better if you can have like running themes, like pick an example that you can reuse a bunch of times instead of just bringing up a bunch of different ones. That was like a problem in the previous video, because he brought up lobsters and then wrens and then chickens, and I was like, why are you bringing up so many different ones? Just pick like one or two that illustrate all the things you want to illustrate and then talk about them. It was kind of chaotic, because he like wouldn't get to the point about lobsters and then we'll talk about wrens, and then didn't get really to the point about wrens fully, and then he was talking about chickens. And so like here he just brought up nature dressing, but that is not going to be a theme. He mentioned it, we put it in our head, and then it goes out of our head again, and we don't think about it anymore. And it's hard to guess when you read it if it's going to be like a thing you're supposed to remember or not. Like, is this a one-off sentence, or am I supposed to like remember this and he's going to elaborate on it? So it turns out he does not elaborate on it. Now we have to think about a musical score instead of dresses. So he's like jerking us around to thinking of all these different things in our head. First we have nature as an agent, then we have nature wearing clothing. Now we have nature like a musical score somehow. And now we have like Alice in Wonderland in the same paragraph. There's so many things. Music produces its deep imitations of me. This is vague, and he immediately changes the topic, so we're not going to get any kind of explanation. So there is a theme in our culture where people think music is really deep in some way. Like, that's a common thing. And they're pretty fucking vague about it. So I'm not a big fan of that way of thinking. Like, I don't hate music or anything. I dislike a lot of music because of the negative themes. Like, a lot of pop music has lyrics with bad ideas about love, for example, and ideas about like life sucks and misery and pessimism. So I don't like that. But like, music's alright. I see some good in it. But there's a way people like seem to overrate it, as far as I can tell, that they aren't very good at explaining. And I think Jordan Peterson is like appealing to those people, and also not really explaining very much, just sort of signaling that he respects them and they should like him too, as just a throwaway example. And it's trying to sound deep, like, this explains this other thing. But I don't think that he's actually offering an explanation here. I think there's a lack of explanatory content in this sentence. I don't think it lives up to the hype. I'm losing my voice, and there's a lot more in this section. I might have to stop mid-section. As the environment supporting a species transforms and changes, the features that make a given individual successful also change. Yes, they partly change, is what I was kind of getting at, and they partly don't change in general, because changes in environment are not random. They're not pure chaos. And they're certainly not adversarial. Like, it's not like there is a person designing the new environment to make the existing traits of animals not work or be unsuitable. Because if you have like an actual adversary just like designing an arbitrary environment, then you can like really you can take whatever traits animals have and make them like actually bad. You can design the environment so they're all like counterproductive, or some approximation of that. It's hard to know exactly what the limits are. But like, the actual world has non-random environmental changes that are not hostile, like not designed for the purpose of ruining adaptations. And so You get some change in what is evolutionarily advantageous, but not so much that there's no overall conception of progress possible. So the theory of natural selection. I mean, I would call it evolution. Does not posit. Like, he's using another fancy word. This isn't an unnecessary fancy word. I know this word, but, like, not everyone knows this word. And even for me, it takes more mental energy to deal with this word than a simpler word, which takes mental energy away from actually understanding his point. Like, instead of the word posit, he could have used the word say. It's not necessary to use this word. It doesn't have some sort of significant advantage. And the worst part is, if the word posit was necessary, if he was using it like in some precise, detailed way, where the difference between the word posit and say was important to him, to his point, that would, like, then readers would get lost, because what readers are going to do with this is figure out, oh, it means something like say, and then keep reading. And fortunately for them, that's going to work in this case. But if he was actually using, if he actually needed the advanced word, then readers would just get lost. It's like, if he was trying to use it, it wouldn't work. He can only get away with this because he doesn't need it. In which case, he really shouldn't be using it. When you want to say, like, fancy things, you have to actually explain yourself rather than just picking a fancy word and hoping readers will look it up and then figure out exactly what you mean somehow. Like, the method of just, I'll figure out the exact perfect English word to get my point across is bad. You need to, if it is a complicated point, you better just write a bunch of simple words that explain the point, instead of relying on, like, one fancy word that's obscure. However, you can use fancy words as approximations of simple words. And people, by an effort, can figure out what you're talking about. Like, plenty of readers can figure out it means something like say and follow the sentence. But it just takes them extra work. It's more that creatures are in a dance with nature, albeit a deadly one. Okay, this is bad. You should not use dance as a metaphor when it is so misleading because you think dancing is non-dangerous and, like, fun and leisure activity. So if you think your metaphor is so misleading that you need a qualifier that it's a deadly dance, not a regular dance, don't use that metaphor. Use a more fitting metaphor. Don't use a bad metaphor and then add an extra clause to try to fix it. So this gives sort of an impression, which fits with some other things he said, that evolution just treads water. It's just the environment changes and it tries to keep up, and the environment changes again and it tries to keep up. And that's not at all what happened. Like, in the past, we had one-celled organisms, and now we have multi-cell organisms. And not only that, but things have advanced to the point of having eyes and to be able to run faster, or all sorts of other features that are good, that are progress, that are good features across a variety of environments. And then, in particular, evolution managed to create computers. And, like, that's fucking impressive, and that's a big deal. That was progress. That was not just dancing with whatever environment happened to come up. That was an overall pattern of progress. Like, it made bigger things and more complex things, and then it made computers, and then it made better algorithms for the computers. Like, the behavior of how wolves hunt evolved and got more effective. It didn't just get more adapted to the particular environment it was in. It, like, you know, it made, like, better strategies from the initial crude ones. And then it got to the point where we got intelligence. So that was progress. That was not just trying to stay in the same place. Like, it's weird to talk about staying in the same place because things got so much more complex and developed over time. It's not all just forward progress. Like, a bunch of complex dinosaurs got evolved and then died out. There's false starts and dead ends and wrong turns and whatever, but so it's not like a straight direct road to progress, but there has been like some overall progress, which is pretty easy to see. Nature's not just dynamic either. Music doesn't model this. Music displays this, or like has this. Music does this. Models is like a fancy word. Modeling is like a thing clever people do and talk about, but it's not the best word here. So this is more focused on impressing people than on thinking about what you mean really clearly and then saying it in the simplest way. Leaves change more quickly than trees. Sure, there's higher level order. Like, Jordan Peterson is intelligent. Like, some of this is wise. Like, having some understanding of layers of chaos and order is good thinking. But I really don't get the impression from this that he's actually an expert on evolution, and he should have been to put this section in his book. And like, he talks about evolutionary psychology like it's related to his profession and stuff. So he ought to be better at this. He's good at some things. Maybe that's part of it, is in general, the things he talks about in his lectures are the things he's best at. And it's somewhat different material than what we're getting right now in this Rule 1. Well, we can see the Domino's hierarchy like we're talking about it. It's written about in this book, so it is seen in some sense. So that's really silly. Like literally, he had to see it in order to mention it, and he did mention it. He named it. If you can name it, that's because you've in some way seen it. This idea of most real is very vague. Nature's not romantic. Right, nature's not pristine in paradise. So, as something pristine and paradisal, like, who says paradisal? That is a very fancy word. And it doesn't have to be written this way. You can just say, as a pristine paradise. That's shorter. You drop something and the and becomes a. And paradisal becomes paradise, so like you're getting one word shorter and a few letters shorter on top of that, and you're dropping the like obscure word. And like something is like, it's the something, and then we have to add attributes to try to know what it is. Why not just directly say what you mean, like a paradise? Like a French Impressionist landscape. That is like not a good reference. Like, most people do not know what French Impressionist landscapes look like. Most people won't look it up either. Like, the only reason so what will happen here is people will figure, oh, French Impressionist landscapes must look like pristine paradises. So they'll like learn what French Impressionist landscapes look like from the sentence. Which is totally not useful, like, because this is supposed to be helping us understand what it looks like, but instead we have to guess what this looks like from what you already said. So to the extent we understand what you're talking about, it's because of this part, and this part is not helping. this is interesting because this looks like farming to me. Like, this is not the state of nature. This is human cultivation. And, like, here as well. Like, this is a farmhouse. Like, they built that house. That's not... Well, maybe this one's not a landscape. I guess, yeah. Okay, that one's not a landscape. And, like, this one's partly a landscape, and it's got the house as well. Like, a lot of these are not just nature. Now, maybe that's Google's fault. Maybe Google did a bad job of showing me what French Impressionist landscapes look like. But, and like, you know, some of them look more natural, but this one, that looks like a little boat. So that's like human cultivation. And is that, oh no, that's a town there. I didn't see it at first, but that's a town. I saw this, I was like, oh, is that like a bell tower or a steeple or something? And I was like, oh, that's a town. That wasn't like rocks or dirt. So, and like this, you see cultivation, like there's a path. Here's another path. This is like an orchard. So no, I don't think this is a good example at all. Because it's not adequately a portrayal of nature. It is significantly a portrayal of humanity and humanity's control over nature. Like this one has a path in it too. Like that is a path right there. That is not just a forest with like a... Is that like a stream? Is that an ocean or something? It's hard to tell what like that little bit of blue is. Like maybe this is a beach instead of a path? It's hard to tell. Because like you get paths somewhat naturally, and also like you get paths created by animals. I don't know, there might be a path. So like cultivation is not natural. Cultivation doesn't come from nature, it comes from humans. I mean, unless you want to call everything natural, because like, I mean, you normally there's a like artificial versus natural distinction where basically human things are artificial and everything else is natural. But you could say that like biological evolution created humans, therefore everything's natural. But then you have to call like spaceships natural and call concrete natural, and so that starts getting silly. But these pictures have lots of things that are the equivalent. They're just more primitive versions of concrete, like paths and houses. So like the romantic conception of nature as pristine in a paradise, it's normally more natural than these paintings that came up. So it's, yeah, really not a good, helpful comparison. He's just showing off about his art knowledge rather than actually thinking of the thing that will maximally help people understand what he's talking about. Like, I actually went to the trouble of looking it up, and it was actually, like, unhelpful and misleading and not a good example. Maybe if you looked it up in a different way, you would get different results. But yeah, there's so much of this has human cultivation in it. They're not all the best examples of French Impressionist landscapes. I don't know where to find better ones. I think that's like a small building or some human built structure in this one here. I think it's mostly a landscape, but there's some like little white things there. I think that's humanity made visible. Eco-activists. Well, that's an interesting way to avoid saying environmentalists. That's diplomatic. Eco-activists. So only the ones who do activism, not the ones who believe it. So this is not accurate because he says even more idealistic in their viewpoint. So he's talking about people who hold a particular viewpoint. But The set of people who hold that viewpoint includes activists and non-activists, but he's identifying only the activists, even though he wants the people with the viewpoint. So in his attempt to be diplomatic and avoid offending environmentalists, which also would be an inaccurate term here because environmentalists like vary a lot, but so do activists too. So like this isn't perfectly accurate, but in any case, like saying activists only is just like not the right concept. Like the activists are the ones who are more worthy of opposition in general. Like I understand some desire to say it's the activists I'm not happy with, but when you're talking about viewpoints, they're not limited to activists. I'm not convinced that their way of thinking is idealistic. Like, it depends exactly what you mean by that and how you define your terms and what you think an ideal is. Like, I think that in some ways they're lacking ideals and quite hateful and stuff. Harmoniously balanced and perfect. I don't know, sort of. Like, there's some elements of this in their thinking, but they're, like, well aware that animals eat each other. And that, like, famines and droughts are natural. And, like, there have been natural ice ages and nature killed off all the dinosaurs. And I guess they try not to think about that stuff too much. Like, there's definitely some evasion there. Absent the disruptions and depredations of mankind. Depredation is another fancy word. Like, he's just, again, this is very consistent, that he's not doing his best to pick the simplest words that will get the job done. And will be, take the least mental energy from the reader, leaving the most left over to contemplate the meaning of the important ideas, like to actually think things through. And to lower the rate of misunderstandings, because misunderstandings are very common. He should expect like an average reader to have thousands of misunderstandings while reading this book. And so the rate of misunderstanding is actually a big deal. Because it's like, if you write like this all the time, you're going to get like 5,000. And if you write in a simpler way, maybe you only get 2,000 misunderstandings for an average reader. Like things like this just cause more misunderstandings. And not like a trivial amount, but like quite a few of them. Like, if you just took this one sentence and you like quizzed people on it and like and you made it like a very harsh quiz, like you're finding out, do they actually understand this like in detail? Do they really get the point of it? You're going to find like a meaningful percentage of readers just don't actually understand it and can't explain what it means very well. And then if you rewrote this sentence in simpler terms, that would change. Like you might go from 50% of readers understanding it reasonably well to 75%. Like it could actually be like quite a big difference. And you know, the rewording wouldn't just be change this one word. If you change this one word, you might add 1% or something, which still matters quite a bit. But there's also like the broader theme of just not trying to write in a simple, clear way to maximize understanding and maximally spread the truth. If he would write more like how he talks, that would be better, because he talks in a way designed to be understandable and get his point across. And he talks in a way that understands that listening is hard. Listening to verbal speech and following all the ideas is hard. So he accounts for that and tries to make things simple. And composing on the fly yourself as the speaker is hard too. But like now the moment that he's writing instead of talking, he either thinks that reading's really easy and he doesn't need to be, he doesn't need to try to scale the difficulty down to help his readers, or maybe it's the moment he's not bottlenecked by his own composition abilities because he has time to like slowly think over what he wants to write. Then he just increases the complexity dramatically with little regard for the audience. But also like this is how our culture writes popular books that are supposedly intellectual. Like, this is very, very standard. So maybe he put effort into writing like other writers do. Maybe he surveyed other books and was copying ideas from them. If so, that's like really sad. Because part of what I like about him is that he's an independent thinker who is right about a bunch of things that a bunch of other people are wrong about. So there's actual like value there. But here I just see him doing the same crap I see everywhere else, which is why I don't read a lot of other books. I mean, there are a lot of books I don't read. I read lots of books, but I'm picky about them. There are lots that I don't like. It's not like I like all the books and just read the ones I have time for. It's I specifically don't read a bunch of them because I think they're bad. And part of the reason for that is the writing style is like this. Often a worse version of this, sometimes a better one. There are authors who are better at this than Jordan Peterson, but there's also a lot more authors who are worse at it. The environment is also elephantitis and guinea worms. Yeah. Yep, and mosquitoes and malaria, starvation level droughts, AIDS, Black Plague. Yes, this is important and not adequately like thought about and well known for our society. Like, somehow our society has let like large numbers of people have this false picture of what primitive life is like that tries to ignore cholera and these other things. Cholera, I think, is a water one. Like, you have to boil water to be safe from it. And it's like, people don't know a lot about it because it's not a problem in the first world today. But it's been a huge problem in the past. Each year today, there's fucking like millions of cases of cholera, causing tens of thousands of deaths, if not over 100,000. That's just like now. So that was much, much worse in the past. I'm curious, like, you know, in the total of human history, like, how many people have died of cholera? Right, but cholera in the US in any significant way was over 100 years ago. So people are so used to our modern environment that they like forget about all the dangers of the natural environment. Edenic, like, this isn't that hard to understand because I can figure out the root word is Eden, but I don't know if I've ever read this word before. This one at least is not trivial to reword. Like paradisal, it was trivial and better to reword with paradise instead, because it actually made it shorter and easier to follow. This one's like reasonably alright. It's pretty short and to the point. Although, so Eden is a thing that only a fraction of the population thinks about much. Like, it's in the Bible, and, you know, I'm an atheist, but I've heard of it, but the reason I knew what he meant, like, instantly is because he's done, like, the Bible lectures, and he's talked about the Garden of Eden in videos I've watched. So given that context, the moment I saw this, I knew what he meant. But if this was, like, someone's first encounter with Jordan Peterson, they'd never heard of him before this book. So they don't know that the Garden of Eden is something he talks about all the time, then they might not immediately recognize it, and that could be a problem. So, like, it would have been more helpful to readers who are not religious and not familiar with additional context if he had actually mentioned the Garden of Eden, because that's a much clearer reference than just Eden, let alone Edenic. The capital does help. Well, it helps me. Some people don't have a very good grasp of what proper names are, or proper nouns. Proper nouns. See, I don't even know the terminology very well, and most people know way less about it. But so people don't have a great grasp of what's capitalized and why, I think. Many people don't. So like the capital E is a big clue for me, but for I think there's a lot of people who just don't really know the difference, and they wouldn't really notice if it was capital or not. I don't think that stands out to everyone. So such things is not a very good reference. It would be better if he gave us like some sort of reminder of what he's talking about, like so dangers or plagues or natural hazards or something. And like the things he's referring to aren't from the previous sentence, they're from like another sentence back. And then, if you kept going back, you run into other things like paintings. So you have to it's not the easiest reference in the world to follow. Like it's not super bad, but these things add up and they're ever present. Like you get like a dozen things that are not maximally easy to follow in one paragraph, and it makes the paragraph a lot harder overall. Like if someone's struggling, that one of the things they're going to try to do is like read the individual sentences. Like, what does this sentence mean? Okay, now what does this sentence mean? Sentences are like natural breakpoints for that. But when you have things in one sentence that refer to a different sentence, that makes it harder. It makes it harder for the person to break it down into parts because they have to understand it more as a cohesive whole. So anyone who's having a hard time, this makes it harder. And even if you're not having a hard time, it just takes a little bit of extra effort. You have to remember some previous thing or reread. And you have to figure out the reference correctly, which is not super hard, but it's not nothing. And then on top of that, not everyone just reads straight through. Like people get distracted. Some people are like mothers and they have like a little kid and the kid wants their attention all the time and they like read a few sentences and then their kid distracts them. And then they read a few more sentences and then their kid distracts them. And if you're reading in that way, which is absolutely a real and important thing, like I've talked with people who do that, who are like multitasking, like they're doing parenting and they get little snippets of time to read a little. Then the more each sentence can be read and understood independently, the easier it is. Like for that person, having to go back and like reread from the start of the paragraph every time they start because they need the context to understand anything is like a problem, because they reasonably often get interrupted mid-paragraph. And like I've tried reading while on the phone and like read a few words here and there in between the person talking, which is kind of similar thing where you're like getting distracted all the time. And how easy to read it is makes a big difference. And I figure I'm really good at reading. I do it a ton. I have practice, etc. I'm smart. Most people are not as good at reading, so I figure me reading when I'm tired or when I'm distracted or something is actually somewhat of a reasonable approximation of what reading is just actually like for a lot of other people. So I try to have some sympathy with people who are not as good at reading as Jordan Peterson, who I imagine is also very good at reading. And I try to write in a simple way that'll work for them. And so also a lot of people read audiobooks, and some of them read audiobooks while doing something else, like multitasking. Like they go to the gym and listen to the audiobook, and they get some distractions and just don't have 100% of their focus on it because they're doing things like switching machines at the gym and setting up a machine and hitting the buttons for which treadmill workout they want and whatever, and these things take some attention away, and so the book does not get their 100% full attention at all times. And back references like this are a lot harder in audiobooks. Like you hear such things and you have to like have the things being referred to in your working memory, and you can't easily reread or check back what he means. You just have to like instantly guess it. And the book just keeps talking, and you don't want to be pausing all the time. So you just do your best to keep up. And stuff like this makes it a lot harder. I notice things like this partly because I speed read. So I speed read audiobooks, like I'll turn up the speed on an audiobook to like triple or something. Or I'll use text to speech and set it at a high speed. Or I also use rapid serial visual presentation. To speed read. So Spreeder.com, and you click on free app, and then here's an example, and see the words just flash. Word. So you can read books that way. I do like 2 or 3 words at a time. I think it's better than 1. But anyways, you can read really fast with that. But with all of those types of reading where you're going really fast, it makes reading harder. And I notice when things are harder to read. The more references there are, the more context changes, the more convoluted sentence structures, the harder it is to read at a high speed. So even though I'm capable of reading something like this normally, my awareness of what it's like to speed read things helps me see how it is harder, and that actually makes a difference. It raises the difficulty of it. So you can think about it as, maybe for me, it makes me speed read this book at 550 words per minute instead of 600 because it's a bit harder to read. And then for someone else who normally reads books at 250 words per minute, maybe it slows them down enough that their effective speed while reading this book is only 225 words per minute. That's the kind of effect it can have. Or alternatively, they might just keep reading at their normal speed and start missing things. Like they might just habitually read at a certain speed, and they understand what they understand, and if they miss stuff, they just keep going. That's very common as well. So this is like, Mother Nature is not an agent. It does not choose. It is not hellbent. It's not our adversary. Like, it's not an intelligent adversary that's working against us. It just works how it works. If we find a way to like fix some aspect of nature, it's not like, oh, but I need to destroy them and like changes itself. It's not modifying itself like that. Right, so this is wrong. Like, this sentence is just wrong and misleading and awful. And it is to some extent an approximate metaphor. And if you read it at a very low level of precision, it's okay. Like, you can read it as Mother Nature does things that are not good for us, like the Black Plague. If you read it at like that level of imprecision, it's like, okay, sure. But what it actually says is just wrong. And it's in the midst of like trying to teach us something in a serious intellectual way, semi-serious intellectual way. So not good. It's now moving on to the third concept. It is 4 hours and 20 minutes. I'm losing my voice. I'm going to call it here. So, summary thoughts. This book is not as good as I was hoping it would be, based on Jordan Peterson's lectures, which I like. I hope that the style may change somewhat for different rules. Because this is all rule 1. Maybe some of the other rules will be talking about different things, and I'll like them better. So I hope this has been educational and useful for people to learn about how to read books more carefully, how to analyze things, how to write better, the truth of some of the matters covered in the books. Like, I've just been talking about some actual issues. If you like it, subscribe to my YouTube, and in the description you can go to my website, which links to my other websites, and it has a newsletter where you can get updates on my work, like this video and my essays and so on. And I have a ton of stuff. If you like what I'm saying, I've got 2,000 blog posts and a bunch of essays and so on.